Bonjour. Est-ce que... Oui, bonjour et bienvenue à cet événement organisé ici à l'Université d'Ottawa. Mon nom est Thomas Junot et je suis un professeur à l'École supérieure d'affaires publiques et internationales ici à l'université. Cet événement est organisé par le CIPI, le CIPS, le Centre d'études en politique internationale, en coopération avec le cabinet de la vice-rectrice à la recherche et à l'innovation. And this event is also part of a U15 Canada new series of events on securing Canada's future, how leading research universities are meeting the moment. So the theme today for the event is the diversification of Canada's security and defense partnerships. Most people, not everybody, but most people today agree that Canada needs to diversify not only its trade relations, but also its security, its intelligence, and its defense partnerships. That's very easy to say, but it's hard to do in practice. Diversify with who? On what issues? According to what priorities? On the basis of which guiding principles? For decades, answering these questions on how to diversify were not very pressing from a Canadian perspective. Most of our time, most of our energy, most of our diplomatic capital, our trade, our defense and security cooperation was with the United States. It was easy and the trade-offs were much less difficult to deal with. So answering tougher questions about priorities, about choices beyond the US were less of a concern. But that is far less the case now as it was for so long. That means that we have to make more difficult choices. As somebody who looks a lot at the Middle East, one example is with Gulf countries. Do we want to focus more of our trade, our security cooperation with Gulf countries like the UAE, like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia? If we make that choice, that does involve a trade-off in terms of human rights. And that's a trade-off that we cannot avoid in a way that we tended to avoid in the past. Another issue that will come up today is that you cannot simply snap your fingers and expect that you will diversify your relations. You need intelligence liaison officers in your embassies abroad. You need diplomats. You need trade promotion officers. You need defense attachés. Do we have enough of them, of all of these positions? Do they have enough of a strategic culture in their institutions, in their agencies and departments to really be able to focus on diversifying our relations? From my perspective, not enough, really not enough, but that's what our speakers today will tell us about. Avant de passer au premier panel aujourd'hui, qui va être sur les questions de défense, je suis très heureux d'inviter la présidente et la vice-chancelière de l'Université d'Ottawa, Marie-Ève Sylvestre, qui va commencer avec un mot d'ouverture. Merci beaucoup.
Merci Thomas, ça promet cette journée. Alors, Madame l'ambassadrice Thjörven Bellman, former Deputy Minister of National Defense Stephanie Beck, Professeur Philippe Lagacé, Monsieur le lieutenant-général Christopher Coates, Monsieur Wayne Eyre, Professeur Alexandra Gissiou, Monsieur David Vigneault, Madame Jody Thomas, Madame Carrie Buck, la vice-rectrice à la recherche et à l'innovation, Julie Saint-Pierre, et professeur Thomas Junot. Kwe, bonjour, good afternoon. C'est un immense plaisir de vous accueillir à l'Université d'Ottawa pour cette importante conférence sur la sécurité et la défense organisée par le Centre d'études en politique internationale, le Réseau d'études sur la sécurité et le Bureau de la vice-rectrice à la recherche et à l'innovation en partenariat avec le U15. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais rendre hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré et ancien qui l'unit à ce territoire non cédé. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. At the University of Ottawa, this land acknowledgement is more than a formality. It reflects our commitment to truth and reconciliation and to the revitalization of Indigenous knowledges, languages, and cultures through our Indigenous Action Plan. Today, the University of Ottawa is proud to host the first event of our new series of conference on building new partnerships in defense and security. It is also the inaugural event in U15 Canada's special series under the theme Securing Canada's Future, How Leading Research Universities Are Meeting the Moment. U15 Canada brings together this country's leading research-intensive universities, institutions that collectively anchor Canada's most advanced research capacity and talent pipeline. We are meeting a pivotal moment for Canada and the world. Technological disruption, shifting geopolitical alliances, and the emergence of a new global order are posing new challenges to sovereignty, economic resilience, and democracy. Dans ce contexte, plusieurs des principes qui ont longtemps guidé les partenariats internationaux, la recherche collaborative et la coopération mondiale doivent être réexaminés. C'est pourquoi il est essentiel de soutenir un dialogue soutenu entre les universités, les gouvernements, l'industrie et nos partenaires internationaux. Canada's leading research universities are proud to contribute to that dialogue, and the University of Ottawa is uniquely positioned to convene it. The University of Ottawa is Canada's only bilingual research-intensive university. We rank 5th in the country for research intensity. Located in the heart of the national capital, we are a place of power and leadership at the intersection of science, commerce, and policy. We are world leaders in photonics and advanced materials, medicine and life sciences, environmental science and the Arctic, as well as law and public and international affairs. Jour après jour, nos chercheurs et chercheuses renforcent la place de l'université comme l'une des universités les plus influentes au Canada en matière de politique publique. Et la présence aujourd'hui de leaders issus du secteur universitaire, gouvernemental et des pays alliés illustre bien cet extraordinaire pouvoir de rassemblement. Universities have an essential role to play in security conversations because they help societies understand complexity. They generate the research, the expertise, and the evidence that inform public policy across issues ranging from defense and cybersecurity to artificial intelligence, Arctic sovereignty, democratic resilience, and international cooperation. They also prepare the next generations of leaders, policymakers, researchers, and professionals who will shape Canada's response in the years ahead. They also offer something equally important, spaces for dialogue, critical reflection, and collaboration. Les enjeux de sécurité d'aujourd'hui ne relèvent plus d'un seul champ d'expertise, ils exigent des perspectives croisées en relations internationales, en droit, en économie, en géographie et en sciences et technologies. Moreover, security is no longer only something universities study. It is also shaping the environment in which research, collaboration, and knowledge production takes place. Research-intensive universities around the world are navigating complex questions related to research security, trusted international partnership, data governance, and dual-use technologies, while preserving the openness, academic freedom, and international collaboration that remain essential to scientific progress and democratic societies. This is not an easy balance to strike, but it is an essential one. Car les universités ont la responsabilité non seulement de faire avancer les connaissances, mais aussi de veiller à ce qu'elles servent la société de manière responsable, éthique et ouverte. À l'Université d'Ottawa, nos chercheuses et chercheurs contribuent activement aux réflexions sur la cybersécurité, le droit, les relations internationales, la résilience démocratique, la souveraineté dans l'Arctique, l'intelligence artificielle et la sécurité de la recherche. Earlier this year, the Office of the Vice President Research and Innovation helped build this momentum through several major gatherings. At the U-Ottawa Nordic Canadian Arctic Symposium on January 28, leaders from government, diplomacy, Indigenous communities, and academia examined the future of the Arctic through the lenses of climate change, sovereignty, and security. More recently, the National Security Innovation Forum brought together leaders from government, academia, industry, and the diplomatic corps to advance Canada-Europe collaboration in national security, emerging technologies, quantum innovation. Together, these events have reinforced U-Ottawa's role as a convener and partner at the intersection of research, public policy, and defense innovation. Nous continuons aussi de former les prochaines générations de leaders grâce à des programmes interdisciplinaires. Through the training offered by our Professional Development Institute and a range of forums and initiatives, we also support the leaders as they navigate increasingly global and complex environment. I would also highlight our highly sought-after master's program in National Security and Defense at the Faculty of Social Sciences, an interdisciplinary program that equips students with the broad perspective they need to address today's challenges. And this is only the beginning. Additional programs are already in the work. In closing, I'd like to thank the Center for International Policy Studies, the Security Studies Network, and the Office of the Vice President of Research and Innovation for this event, as well as all of our speakers, partners, and participants who are joining us from different sectors and disciplines. Je tiens aussi à souligner tout particulièrement le leadership du professeur Thomas Junot, professeur à l'École supérieure d'affaires publiques et internationales, dont les travaux font autorité sur les enjeux de sécurité, de renseignement, de politique étrangère et de défense au Canada, ainsi que sur le Moyen-Orient. Son parcours qui allie recherche universitaire de haut niveau et expérience au sein du ministère de la Défense contribue de façon exceptionnelle à la qualité de cette journée. I hope today's discussion will spark new ideas and partnerships and sustain collaboration. Merci encore à vous tous et toutes d'être présents parmi nous. And now I turn it over to you, Professeur Junot. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. So I would invite right away our first panel to come on the podium so that we can start right away.
Can you hear me? Great. Merci, Marie-Ève. Merci, Thomas, and welcome to our first panel that will focus on the question how to diversify in defense. My name is Thjörven Berman. I'm the German ambassador here in Canada, or 50% of the German ambassadors, as I share this position with my husband, as you may know, on a rotational basis. And the embassy, I would say, has collected some experience on the change in philosophy here in terms of procurement and defense, given that, as you know, we are one of two bidders remaining in the submarine bid for the replacement of the Canadian fleet, a topic I try not to talk about too much today. So diversifying Canada's defense partnership and especially procurement is a topic that has been discussed for many years, but I think never so intensely as since the government of Prime Minister Carney came to power. And we are joined this morning by three excellent experts to discuss opportunities, but also challenges in this endeavor. I don't really think any of you needs introducing, but for the sake of propriety, I will do so very quickly. So please join me in welcoming Stephanie Beck to my left, who has been Canada's Deputy Minister for National Defense until recently, and I can say a truly wonderful colleague to work with. Stephanie, you have also been the Deputy Minister for Agriculture, and that's something that strikes me, how civil servants here move between ministries. But also the Associate Deputy Minister for D&D, and you had also a very distinguished diplomatic career with posts such as the Deputy High Commissioner to the UK and many other foreign postings. Very warm welcome. With us also is Professor Philippe Lagacé, Associate Professor and Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Professor Lagacé's work focuses, amongst other things, on defense policy and procurement. He's a very sought-after expert, and I can say I've sought many times advice from him. And he also served on various independent review panels for the Department of National Defense between 2012 and 2022. Welcome. And then last but not least, I'm thrilled to present Christopher Coates, Director of Foreign Policy, National Security and National Defense with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a retired Lieutenant General after 34 years of service in the Canadian Armed Forces. And we all want to thank you for this service. Christopher Coates has served as a military helicopter pilot and Deputy Commander of NORAD, a function I'm sure we will come back to during this discussion. Welcome. So we will start with the moderated discussion and then later on open the discussion to questions from the audience. And I will ask my panelists here to be frank and open, because if we want to cut deeper into or dive deeper into this question than just a sort of vague agreement that diversification to a certain degree is a good thing, I think openness helps achieving that aim. So Stephanie, I will start with you. As someone who has led the Department of National Defense and this work until shortly before the publication of the Defense Industrial Strategy, in your view, how has the approach through that strategy really changed? How much will build, partner, buy, which is the narrative that underwrites the strategy, really contribute to diversification? And what does diversification actually look like? Is it procurement only? Is it defense strategic partnerships? What's your take on that?
Thank you. That's a huge question. We're very proud of the Defense Industrial Strategy, something I think that was a long time coming and very necessary, and actually had advice from many of you in the room, including those up on stage, on what exactly is needed. Where we really focused our efforts, though, was on the private sector, on industry, on defense industry in particular in Canada, on what is it you need to succeed. And I think that's where the tie-in with diversification comes. If you backtrack and think about what are we trying to achieve, and it's a stronger Canada, a more resilient Canadian society, a defense force that is stronger. Is that better? Or maybe I speak like this, like Taylor Swift, yeah? Ish, you know? Shall I start again? Pour les gens qui sont à l'écran, c'est peut-être difficile. En fait, where I was going is the importance of the defense industrial strategy really lies in the fact that it's a mechanism for diversification. We're trying to get to a place where the Canadian Defence Forces, the CAF, are in a much stronger position to defend Canada. And remember, the original mandate of the forces: detect, deter, and defend. So everything we do in the Government of Canada to strengthen the CAF to be able to deliver that mandate is the ultimate goal of the drafting of the strategy, and indeed all of the other mechanisms. So when we talk about diversifying partnerships, it's really at all levels. The federal government has tools internationally, of course: foreign policy, defense policy, international trade policy, and how and with whom we have arrangements and agreements means that we can leverage those in very different ways, again, always with the end goal from a national defense perspective of strengthening the CAF. The defense industrial strategy was aimed at giving the private sector the tools to be able to do the same thing, to actually diversify, for instance, their supply chains, to make sure they had access to banks, to loans, to more support that they need to be able to deliver cheaper, faster, better for the Government of Canada through the Canadian Armed Forces. And then the third leg, and I know everyone else needs to answer, is Canada as a whole. The provinces and territories also need to do their bit on making sure that infrastructure is in place for shipping, for transportation across the country, that there aren't strange rules in place that inevitably lead to limits on production or where the facilities can be built. And I think here, as an example, anything to do with ammunition, always all kinds of permits required and complications for good reasons. But if the goal is to create a strengthened Canada, the whole of Canadian society and provinces and levels of government, including municipalities, need to step up.
Thank you for that. Professor Lagacé, over to you. We often hear the notion that it is the political level that wants the diversification, but that the armed forces are very reluctant to actually go there. I certainly hear from German defense industry that it's still difficult to make our products known here, that some of the RFPs are still tailored to US products, etc. What's your take on where we are, and what is actually, in your view, the aim of diversification, and do you now have the tools to do it?
Thank you. So I would generally agree that there's a propensity to want to stay with the status quo as it's existed. And that's not simply a cultural predilection towards American alliance. It's rooted in a number of things that are difficult to move off. The first, obviously, is geography. We're not moving, or we're not going anywhere. We're going to be having to defend the continent alongside the United States. And the armed forces are always aware of the fact that as much as defense spending may be going up now, there will be leaner years. And in that circumstance, when you're forced to pare down, you're going to be forced to go back down to the essentials. And those essentials are linked into that continental relationship. Equally important is the technological piece. The reality is, given the American defense spend, and both governmentally and also within their private sector, they have a technological edge on a lot of things that could be developed here. And the reality is that the United States still provides the technological backbone for the alliance as a whole. And this is not simply a problem for Canada, it's a problem for Europeans as well. So even when we speak about diversification, the reality is this is a 10 to 20 year endeavor if you are to realistically build up some kind of parallel system next to what the United States provides technologically. So for Canada, and you would imagine if you're a prudent planner within the armed forces, the political side is telling you they have this ambition to move off, to diversify, to not simply be effectively the 51st state in all but name militarily. But you have to ask, okay, is that spending going to be there in 10 to 20 years? Is that desire, is that really going to maintain itself such that I can maintain that parallel system? If I do it in cooperation with my other allies, are they all going to agree amongst the Europeans, or are some of them going to defect and end up siding more with the United States? And then some of the costs that have to be borne to make that diversification happen are going to disproportionately fall on a smaller number of allies. So the way I like to phrase it is there's basically two time horizons. In the short term, it makes perfect sense why the national security and defense community here is trying to hedge its bets, because it worries about what happens over the long term. Are we really committed to this? Politically, you have to undertake basically a generational shift. And currently, Canada has options, but no choice. The question becomes, do we want to leverage those options to create choice? And that ultimately is going to have to be a societal level endeavor. And I think the defense industrial strategy is a first step in that direction. But we have to understand from a prudential point of view of security services and defense services, they want to actually see if this is real first before I think they commit to it fully.
Thank you, Lieutenant General. It is clear, and we've just heard it from Philippe, that Canada's defense is heavily intertwined with the US. The very architecture of NORAD is a joint one. We all, of course, took note of the Prime Minister's announcement on the Global Eye procurement negotiations during CANSEC. There's reporting again in the press about a possible splitting up of the jet fighter fleet. In your view, as a former deputy commander for NORAD, how much of diversification really makes sense given that strong the joint architecture? And where do you see the fighter jet procurement going?
Well, on to the first of those. The value of diversification for NORAD. When I was in a NORAD position, not when I was the deputy commander, but previous to that, the Americans had a situation where they had to ground their F-15 fleet. An aircraft had fallen apart in flight. And the F-15s, the F-15 Eagles, a fighter aircraft that NORAD was using to defend Alaska. NORAD turned to Canada and said, can you backfill these fighters? And so the Canadian fighters that were stationed in Bagotville flew up, and we sent the maintainers and everything else that was required. And we were able to, as Canadians, then backfill in Alaska while the F-15 fleet did some maintenance actions and until they got back on station. And so that diversification, the diversity then that was inherent between the Canadian and the US fleets was useful to NORAD. Right now in Alaska, there's an option between using F-22s and F-35s to defend Alaska. They wouldn't turn to the F-18s, I don't think, today to do that. But there's a built-in redundancy that allows them to do very effectively the job they need to do. So I think there's an inherent value for NORAD to have some degree of diversity in the fleets that they operate, the communication systems that they use, in the aircraft that are employed. But that's a value that results from a bunch of other factors that have led the U.S. to have different aircraft that they can choose from. That's not what's driving the decision-making in the Canadian circumstance. And so I think from a NORAD perspective, we, Canada, can bring a diversity of thought. We can bring diversity of approaches. We can provide different communication systems, perhaps, that will be useful to NORAD. And that's something that, you know, we should strive to add to the relationship. I don't know that I would see a lot of value in stepping backwards and in reducing capacity as part of the value proposition to diversification. And so whether one's considering from a NORAD perspective, Global Eye versus Wedgetail, or Gripen versus F-35, I think we should start from, as has been mentioned already, the capabilities perspective and what's required. Start there. And then if there are equal options, then that might be something that's worth considering as a function of adding value. But I think the starting point is around the capabilities that the systems can provide, and are they what all of you would want your sons and daughters and neighbors operating to defend Canada in particularly challenging circumstances. And so I think, you know, the value starts first with what we're bringing to the operation. And then secondly, I think, you know, there's this notion of, can we provide additional value on top of that with some optionality? And that's, you know, what a diversified force could do.
And if you allow me a follow-up to this, General Guillot, the NORAD commander, has famously testified in front of the Armed Services Committee that he'd actually prefer for the NORAD function modernized fourth-generation fighters, and that in numbers, instead of fifth-generation fighters that he sees more in a different role. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I know General Guillot fairly well, and I don't agree with that assessment. I think that the challenges that are on the horizon for Canada are those that are going to require Canada to be able to operate fifth generation and sixth generation, eventually sixth generation fighters, to provide a credible deterrent to our adversaries. I'm not of the view that fourth generation fighters are looking forward. I'm not sure that a fourth generation fighter, even in mass, provides the kinds of capabilities that are going to serve a deterrent value. If one is considering the difference between defending and deterring, maybe there's a different battle that can take place. Maybe there's a different scrimmage that's involved. But deterrence is something that occurs in the mind of the adversary. And I think that primarily the role of NORAD is one of deterrence, and that's achieved, I think, with the kinds of capabilities that are forward-looking, not looking backwards.
Billy, back to you, and we will go in reverse order now. We have experienced through the submarine procurement with this, the strategy on the one hand wants to create jobs here and wants to build up an industry. On the other hand, it has to be about the best capabilities for the Canadian Armed Forces. And there's a natural tension as part of this equation. So do you think the strategy and the government are clear in terms of what really is the priority? Also, when we look to the ITB reform that has been announced during CANSEC, is it to build the industry and create jobs? Is it a factor of a middle power agency strategy? Is it to get the best possible capability for the Canadian Armed Forces in the shortest amount of time? Is it all of that in a way?
I think from the Prime Minister's view, it's probably all of that at the same time. Is the machinery of government here in Ottawa designed to achieve all those different objectives simultaneously? I think that's where tensions arise. Even with around the cabinet table, one gets a sense that there's disagreement and different views being expressed, and it's hard sometimes. You almost feel like there's 3 or 4 different defense ministers, each kind of coming at the file from a different perspective. And trying to reconcile that would require clearer direction from the Prime Minister as to what exactly is being prioritized on a given file. But it's a balancing act, because on the one hand, you do need to sustain public support for this level of expenditure. And the only way that you can support that level of expenditure with the support required is that Canadians need to see tangibly that they are getting something for this. It's part of the challenge when you're dealing with an insurance policy. You're effectively paying into it, and if it's something that you yourself can understand why you have to pay into it or why it's so expensive, you can support it. But if it's something very intangible, which is something like defense, and I think Canadians are still deeply rooted in the notion that fundamentally the threats are never going to really come here in a military sense, right? There's still an inherent skepticism around that. And so you have to bring the public on board. And when you look at what the polling is telling us, the polling is telling us that it is because of a belief that this defense dollar will ensure a degree of prosperity, will bring IP to Canada, which has been identified as a key variable in growing Canadian productivity, and that governments can use to build up support for what they're trying to do. But I would also caution against this other notion that there is a platonic ideal of what the forces need that somehow exists out there. At the end of the day, forces exist to fulfill government policy and to do what the government directs them to do. And I think that's what's really lacking in the conversation right now. We are operating in a situation where there is a lot of defense money being spent. We're being told that there's an industrial strategy, but the capability side of the question is a little absent right now because we're relying on defense policies effectively from another era, from the pre-Trump era. And so I would like to know, and I think we should all be encouraging government to get moving on this, of what exactly is it that you want the Canadian forces to do with $150 billion a year? And that's not only important for industry to know what to build, but it's also to explain to Canadians, why are we spending this? What exactly are we doing with these forces, and what do we expect from them? So once that's clear, I think it'll be easier to balance those different equations. But we really, I think, need an updated policy telling us what exactly we expect the forces to be able to accomplish with this money.
Yeah, and I think that's a question which culturally for us is very different, because what we want our armed forces to do is a NATO conversation with detailed targets that NATO defines on what the role of the German armed forces is as part of their, the various defense plans we have. Whereas for you, it's a different architecture. Stephanie, in Europe, the situation, I think, is a bit different, or even the reverse from what we see here in Canada on procurement. We are highly diversified in our procurement, and even where we thought we had the same systems, we had to find out in Ukraine the hard way that often, ammunition doesn't match the system, the launcher and the missile are different, even if it's the same system across countries, and it all doesn't match. So I think on the European NATO side, there's rather a tendency to try and see whether we can harmonize that. And the way we do it, for example, is to procure a lot of what we do through procurement coalitions or partnerships around a capability. So take submarines, we can build them our own. We sell to a lot of countries in the world. We still decide to partner with Norway for 10 plus years now, because it creates economies of scale, it creates a bigger fleet, et cetera, et cetera. AWACS is another example where I think Canada left the AWACS coalition some time back. The European Sky Shield Initiative, which is a procurement coalition around a layered system of air defense off the shelf, plus in some way are also development. It's called European, but it's essentially a NATO coalition of the willing. The European long-range strike approach, which is the same thing in deep precision strike systems, where it's a mix of what you can buy and what you can try to build together. So it's all the same model where you try to create economies of scale, where you buy off the shelf, and it gives you a lot of interoperability. You can develop doctrine around it, etc. Where's Canada in there? Is that an approach that you are thinking about, or is it still very much US, non-US, and then it's a binary? Is there another weapon system, but not necessarily much thinking about bigger coalitions?
I think ultimately any form of procurement that gets us what we need soon at a reasonable price is the best one. Right? Does it matter if it's in a group or if it's developed at home or if it's American or if it's French or if it's German? I mean, always better to have a range of partnerships for a variety of reasons, including what was talked about here earlier, is to have some redundancy in the system. If we all have the same piece of equipment and it fails for X reason, then we're all in the same boat in terms of difficulties ahead to meet our objectives. But if we can develop systems at home, and this is really part of the defense industrial strategy, was yes, in some cases we do not have the technology that we need right now in Canada, but we need partnerships to create that in Canada so that we can turn at home when we do need that. If there's another version of a pandemic, for instance, remember in the pandemic, we discovered we can't even make vaccines in Canada. That was a big aha moment for the federal government. And indeed, something similar has happened as we review everything we need to buy for the armed forces and realize how much of it does not come from Canada. And also, even in terms of supply chain, how much of it we could create in Canada. So one of the other big changes in the last year or so was what we did in terms of research and development. So a lot more funding going into Canadian research and development, a lot more joint activity with the Canadian Armed Forces and in particular the Defense Research Agency. And in that, I would include with allies, with partners. So for instance, give an example, we signed an agreement with the United Kingdom so that we can do more joint research and development at Suffield in southern Alberta. We have the space. They have been there for many years. This is a fantastic place that we can all use and open to allies and other partners as well. Another aspect to the Arctic over-the-horizon radar, you know we're buying from Australia, BAE Systems Australia. Part of that agreement is that we will do joint research and development on future iterations and on the adaptation of that technology for Canada. Very different here, obviously, than in the Australian outback. So that sort of work already underway. And I think, I don't know the details, but when I saw negotiations starting on the Global Eye, some of that will be around the developing the technology of the future and the adaptations that are needed for the Canadian landscape, which is very different, as we know, from Europe. If you're flying up and down a small territory, it's not the same needs and challenges as flying around Canada.
And Christopher, back to you. In terms of, and Stephanie just spoke to that, the fact that the nature of war changes. We see that in Ukraine very clearly. We see some of it in the Gulf because technology changes. And when you take the Ukrainian case, you can see how for the first time now they have a technological edge really in terms of the life cycle of the algorithms for drones, et cetera, et cetera. AI, quantum, robotics, all of that will play a bigger role in future war. How does that fact that these technologies, there's a few countries that are really good in these technologies, not so many in the world. How does that relate to the diversification piece?
Sorry, I thought you were asking. So I think your observation is a great starting point, that technology is now evolving so much more rapidly than it had in the past. The kinds of technology, counter technology, and counter technology aren't new. That militaries have been facing that for since history, but it occurred on scales that were generational. It might take an awful long time to develop a bow and arrow after having developed a sword or a spear. In the Second World War, the counter technologies were evolving on the scales of years, but they were still happening. Today, what we're seeing in Ukraine is the technology is, and counter technologies are developing on the weeks kind of scale. And we still have an industry in Canada that's built on an older model that allows technologies to be developed over long periods of time and sold and protected as a sort of line of business for quite some time. And that model will be challenged to try and meet the kind of technological cycles that are taking place in Ukraine. And so it's not just a diversification of a supply chain, but we're going to have to completely rethink how we implement one part of our defense architecture to support rapid technological adaptation. So that's not a diversification in the kind of sense that it's seek external suppliers. It's how do we act internally as well. We're still going to have to require the kinds of heavy equipment, large ships, large airplanes, and armored vehicles. Those won't disappear from the battlefield, but there are new dimensions that will have to be accommodated. So I think that's a diversification internally that's going to have to take place. We will require, if we're to be relevant and effective in the future, not only the kinds of existing industrial capabilities, but a whole new breed of technologically, rapidly, dynamically flexible technologies to deal with the kind of battlefield that's now developed. And largely, the Canadian Forces observed that from a distance, but we didn't get involved in information age kind of capabilities in an industrial way as up till now.
It is certainly a challenge for all of us, and I can say for our armed forces, we try to partner very intensely now with Ukraine in order to take these lessons and you know, change the way our army is doing things. I will ask one last question to whoever wants to answer on the panel, and please, public, prepare for your questions then afterwards. So in terms of the, you know, I sense from our companies a real interest, and also from the part of the government, to diversify supply chains, including to Canada. It has reasons for scaling up. It has reasons, it has security reasons to have redundancies, and also have, you know, suppliers that are geographically further away. We don't know what's going to happen in Europe in the next years to come. And at least we are preparing very intensely for a situation. I mean, the goal is to make sure deterrence doesn't fail, but also to credibly, which feeds into that, prepare for a situation where deterrence might fail and we might actually see a larger conflict in Europe. Part of when you actually try to do it and map the companies here and find them and try to see whether they, you know, can produce on the level that they are competitive in terms of the price and you know, there in some of them you can see that there is still some way to go. Also for Canada, I suppose when you want to build the defense industry here, what the armed forces will order will probably never be enough for a certain company to be able to live on that. At least that's the case with us. So there come questions like export control policies, and Thomas alluded to that in his introduction. So, you know, the basis, I think, has been well laid out with the strategy, but there will be a lot of follow-on questions in terms of possible support for companies to, you know, set up production lines that are on a different scale than they are today, and in terms of these policy pieces, how far is there still the way to go? Is it all in place? What's your take? And please, whoever wants to go, and then the others to weigh in.
I'll start because it gathers together several of the things that we've talked about already. You know, in the past, to be fair, if the military thought that they were going to have one shot at a particular piece of equipment, of course they wanted everything on it. Of course you want the best possible piece of equipment. And inevitably that meant a long time in thinking about, okay, we'll have this kind of red thing on it and a blue one and 4 of these and 6 of those. C'est normal. But if you're talking about a very different procurement process where you need to leave room for the innovation, for the changes, and to be able to integrate all of those as they become known, because that is part of the problems. We don't know necessarily what sort of technology will be available in 5, 10 years. So that's 2 things that need to change: the internal process and the way we think about what it is that we need, the capabilities that we're after, and think more about what the situation will be like, and therefore what sort of tool do we need to deal with it, which is a very different conversation from saying I want 4 black chairs with holes in them. And that conversation is the one that now we are allowed to have with industry, to sit down right at the twinkle of the eye moment and talk about the situation in 5, 10 years, watching what happened in Ukraine, watching what's happening in Asia Pacific. We think that means we're going to need this kind of equipment or this kind of technology, and working with the industry to get to that, and then being able to help them scale up. So are we doing procurement the right way to be able to do that? Is it iterative? Do we have the funding? It's another important question. The funding that we have received, the Government of Canada has received through the fiscal framework, is long-term funding. There is money in the fiscal framework for decades to come. Hence the much higher level of confidence in the CAF and, of course, in the industry itself. And that alone gives industry the impetus, galvanizes ideas, makes them want to sit down and think things through with the military at the same time. And then one last thing on export controls: there is no defense industry in Canada without exports. Most of what is produced in Canada will be exported. This means, yes, we have rules and legislation and permits required. We need a whole lot more certainty for businesses that, yes, they will be able to export X or Y thing in the time comes. And then furthermore, another challenge I discovered last year is not only do they need to be able to export it once, when it's sent back home for repairs, they need to be able to export it again back to the initial client. And this is the kind of thing that annoys businesses no end and causes all sorts of frustration internally in government as well. And I think we're on track to cleaning that up too, but it's not easy.
Other comments on that one?
Just a very quick one on the export question. I mean, I think that's the one part of the defense industrial strategy that struck me as the least baked. So there was some discussion of trade commissioners and grow better teams there, but it's still a bit of a void. And it is very odd to see Global Affairs Canada getting cut pretty deeply at a time when you want to export more. And by the same token, a little bit of wishy-washiness around who we're actually going to be exporting to. The reality is, if you want to be France, well, you have to have France's values when it comes to exporting. I'll just leave it at that. You just have to view the world a little differently, right? And are Canadians comfortable with that? And I think that's one of these areas where it is incumbent on the government to have an honest conversation about Canadians about what this means, so that they're not suddenly surprised 5, 10 years down the road where equipment is going to places where Canadians may not be fully comfortable with. I mean, we're already having this discussion around the Rochelle armored vehicles that are being sold to the United States, and the United States government is giving them the ice. And the NDP is saying, block this export. And the government is being Canadian government and just sticking its head in the sand and hoping the problem goes away. I mean, that's not a way to deal with it. You have to come out and explain what the principles are, or you're going to get caught with a lot of pressure around where weaponry is going. And you want to be able to have a firm answer and explain to the Canadian public what the principles you're applying are.
And to be fair, it's not an easy, it's not an easy question. We certainly struggle with it.
And not that the Rochelles are weapons.
Lieutenant General, you want to add?
Just, I'd like to build on a point that Professor Gasson made earlier and just now about being honest with Canadians. So there's an adage that you will have somebody's military. You'll either have your own or someone else's protecting you. If we as Canadians want to have our own military protecting us, then I think we have to advance a little bit in our security thinking and our security culture, and understanding what it is we're going to do with this $150 billion, as was mentioned earlier. What is it that Canada wants its military to do, and what are we prepared to accept some risk in? Where are we going to prioritize, and what partnerships are we going to seek to make that happen? Because you're right, we don't have an industry that can be supported by the kinds of things that the Canadian military will buy. But we have no idea what the future is going to look like. We just have to establish a different framework for having those conversations and those discussions than the one we have now.
Great. My personal theory is a lot of build, partner, buy will actually be partner in order to square the circle around all these questions. I will now open the discussion to the audience. We have roughly half an hour left. So someone has to make a start and ask the first question. The gentleman in the back, and please state your name before and function before you ask the question.
Hello, my name is Jean-Félix Lapointe. I'm a student in Security and Defense here at the University of Ottawa. My question is regarding the contract of the submarines that the Canadian government is finalizing, is currently finalizing. I wanted to see if the panel had any opinion on why TKMS or the German submarine would be a better option as opposed to the Hanwha Ocean submarine deal.
I'm the chair, so I will ask the panel.
Well, I think what's interesting is how the bid is being evaluated. So 50% on the maintenance piece, I believe 30% on capability, if I'm not mistaken. And what's interesting there is through the down select process, you've already gotten to a point where the RCN seems to have indicated that both boats effectively meet the mandatory requirements. And I don't really have line of sight, maybe others do, on whether or not there's tiered requirements included in that piece. And if there are, those might be materially different, but it is interesting just how relatively small the actual capability piece is as part of the overall evaluation, vice the maintenance, which is where all the money is, and economic benefits and things like that. So going back to the Gripen F-35 debate, you may recall a little while ago, there was a leak made to CBC, kind of showing the evaluation tables. And it was really interesting just how influential those mandatory, or those tiered requirements were to the full-on evaluation. So my guess is, though, in this case, that it will be more a question of those economic benefits that are going to be the tipping point as opposed to the capability itself.
I will have to do my little pitch now. Just very briefly, I think the difference really is between a more classical procurement producer-consumer type of relationship and a strategic partnership between three NATO allies, two of them Arctic nations. The economic benefit, I think, will be a huge element. I think both bidders have done their best to try and make that attractive. You will have seen the number of over 650,000 job years in the German bid. The South Koreans also have significant elements in there. So for us, it's really the amount of jobs that the Canadian forestry industry would support over the next 20 years. That's the volume we're talking about. Or in terms of GDP, the GDP of Saskatchewan, in terms of GDP value of this bid. So the government will evaluate the two bids. and we'll decide before the end of the month, and then we will see where we go from there. Next question. The gentleman over there.
Yes, George Jacobi used to be a foreign service officer trying to sell some of this stuff in places like Libya and Iran. So the whole question of sanctions dominated by the US comes up in, as to what kinds of military and other dual-use equipment we can sell. But I really wanted to ask whether in European or Canadian defense procurement planning, do you think any consideration is being given to the US as a threat, as opposed to simply Russia and China in some of the decision-making that's going on? And of course, if Trump and his tariffs are, if we're liberated from Trump and his tariffs very, very shortly, perhaps there will be less necessity to spend all this money on defense, and we can spend it on something else.
A very political question.
I was getting worried for a moment because there was a General Jacobi who was the commander of NORAD at one point, and I thought I was being set up. In my contacts, my network, no, nobody is considering the U.S. as a military threat to Canada. I'm aware through interactions like these that that isn't the opinion amongst all Canadians. And I think that's an unfortunate byproduct of the kind of information environment that we're in, and not a result of rational discussions. But certainly the military professionals in Canada and the United States that I'm in contact with are collaborating like they were previously. That has not changed. There's no reason that I would see that we would think of the United States as a threat. And for a nation that with 70% of its trade with a country, it's hard to think of that as a threat. I'd prefer to see it as an opportunity. I was going to comment on the last part of your question, and that slipped my mind. Could you just shout quickly the last part of your question?
Trump and his tariffs go away after the midterms or
Right,
after
thanks.
2 years. Will we have to spend this amount on defense?
So I think that's sort of part of the problem. I don't think we should be investing in defense because of an economic tariff war. I think there's another way to look at what's happened globally, and that the U.S. hasn't reset the economic framework, it's reset the security framework. And now we are, as Canada, seeing the real price of security and defense in the world in which we live, and being asked to contribute to it. Perhaps the language being used is offensive, but the idea isn't. I think if we were to look around the world today, the actual threats coming from Russia and China, for example, won't go away when the U.S. administration changes. And that's, if we are to be a good partner to our allies, and that's part of what the Prime Minister said in his statement in June, and why we're reinvesting, rearming the Canadian Forces, is to be able to help protect our allies as well, that I still see that requirement persisting.
Yeah, and I can say certainly from a German and I'm sure European perspective, I mean, the US remains a hugely important ally for us. And also we don't invest in our defenses because of any sort of, because of NATO targets. We invest in our defenses because there's a very real threat out there and already a war on the European continent. And, a very uneasy situation for the years to come, and a real threat that this can enlarge. So the atmosphere back home in our Ministry of Defense and our armed forces really is that we are in a race against time in order to make sure that our armed forces are where they need to be.
If I could add, I think a greater concern about the US is their absence, especially if we're talking about NATO or indeed other conflicts around the world where we could in the past have relied on the Americans to step up and take a very much a leadership role. If in fact that's not going to happen, and we've seen occasional drop-offs in interest over the last few years, that means NATO, the rest of NATO needs time to get strong enough to be able to defend according to the charter in the way that we need to do. And there is no way that cutting back on defense spending would help. On the contrary. And in fact, if anything, if you look at where we have invested the money, certainly in the past year and in the first few years that are coming up, we're really just rebuilding from below the average, right? We're not somehow getting to 120% of what we need. We're getting from 30 to 51, right? We're actually filling in the holes in the runways. We're making sure there's drinking water on the bases. We're making sure that the military have assault rifles that work. This is really just the basics for now, making sure they have equipment that won't fall out of the sky or sink. The recent announcements about the snowbirds is, I think, a good example of that. Those aircraft are 60 years old. They need to be replaced.
I'll just if I can jump in very quickly. The one thing I will say though, we do have to be mindful. The Eisenhower's warning at the end of his term about trying to sustain over the long term a victory over the Soviet Union and not spending yourself too far and extending yourself is still something we have to keep in mind. The Chinese don't need to beat us militarily. They just have to look at the US debt and just watch it grow and grow and grow and look at our demographics. Same in Europe. Look at it, the debt levels, look at the demographic levels, look at how unsustainable all of this is, and just hang back and let us defeat ourselves. So we also have to be kind of mindful of the overall economic trends here. So yes, the spending is important, but our main adversary is not engaging in the same kinds of arms race, right? They're letting us indebted ourselves to a significant degree and making us economically dependent on them to such a degree that they'll have far more leverage than we realize. So that is another kind of piece of this equation, is just realizing you have to always keep in mind just how much you're asking of your population, where your demographics are, and is this sustainable over the long term with the populations that you have? And that worries me quite a bit.
That's true, but of course that's also, politicians shape the way, or can shape the way, or have a role in shaping the way to make the case and for the population. So next question. Yes, over there.
Hi, I'm Max Pequel. I'm a sailor. I have a question for the general. Obviously, we've spent the last 20 years basically shooting ourselves in the foot with fighter procurement, and now Poland has a fifth-gen fighter well before we are expected to get one ever. That being the case, given our history on fighter procurement recently, what sort of path forward do you see for Canadian procurement of a five and a half, or sixth generation fighter platform?
Thank you for your service. My brother was also in the Navy, and there are a couple other Navy veterans in the room. The path forward, I think Canada should end the 20-year misery and make a decision and move forward with the purchase of the F-35. And then Canada should commit to being part of a program for a sixth-generation fighter, and there are a couple of them in the world. And that's where Canada should focus its defense and industry efforts to be part of those programs and partnerships to help build Canadian industry around that future. If along that path circumstances require that Canada diversify its fighter fleet in some way, then those would be options that should be explored at that time.
Yes, please.
Wesley Work, Center for International Governance Innovation. I wanted to ask any of the panelists whether they had any response to the quoted remarks by Elbridge Colby criticizing Canadian political rhetoric and defense policy. Thanks.
Can you repeat the exact the quote was not
Oh, sorry.
eligible.
Probably here. I was wondering if the panelists had any comments on Elbridge Colby's criticisms of Canadian political rhetoric and defense policy and spending.
No, I can't answer on the political rhetoric part, but where do I start? What we are doing in the North, in the Arctic, and the billions of dollars of infrastructure spending that is underway, and indeed decisions like Arctic over-the-horizon radar, very much reflect our total commitment to the binational command where the general served, and the knowledge that we have that the importance of this arrangement cannot be overstated. The longest binational command on the planet, to the best of my knowledge, the most effective. From a military perspective, it works very well indeed. From an intelligence perspective, and there'll be more conversation about that later in the afternoon, Mr. Colby would know much of this himself. There are clearly other reasons that he felt important to enunciate in the way he did his views, but the fact remains that it's a system in place, a partnership in place that works very well, and that we would very much like to maintain. And maybe one last thing, when we're making decisions, we as Canada making decisions about where we want to invest the large amounts of money that have come to national defense, they're very much first and foremost what's in the national interest of Canada. Is this piece of equipment, is this new process, program, whatever it might be that we're creating, going to make Canada stronger? And that is the crux of decision making in the government. And in many cases, there's good overlap with American interests, and others there isn't. But that's okay, as long as the end result is we are in a stronger, better place.
I think the former deputy's comments at the end are probably what piqued Colby in this administration the most. Namely, when you look at NORAD modernization, what's been announced and what's been done since 2017, it's pretty difficult to then go to Canada and say, well, you're not doing enough for the defense of North America or the defense of the Arctic, or you haven't laid out in specific detail yet how you're going to reach the 3.5. I think a lot of that is excuse. I think the larger issue is an administration that's taking a very different attitude towards how it deals with its allies. Namely, we're not asking you to do this. We're telling you to do this in a particular way. And if you don't do it the way that we're telling you, then you're going to get needled. So I think part of the irritation is around the fighter. Part of the irritation is probably around Wedgetail and other capabilities, and part of the irritation is the diversification. Colby specifically linked the Davos speech. It's, we want you to spend more, we want you to do more, but we want you to do more the way we want you to do it. And that's, if the Canadian reaction is, well, no, we have our own ideas about how we want to do this, that's going to provoke a reaction from this administration. And it will find ways to poke you, and we shouldn't be surprised. We often talk about the fact that people say, well, the Trump administration doesn't realize other countries have agency and that they're going to react to what the United States does. Well, we shouldn't make the same mistake. The United States will react to things that we do if they don't like it. And we just need to be ready for that and the fact that that will happen.
Yes, please. First, the lady in blue and then the gentleman.
Hi, my name is Nati Pressman. My question is, I feel that correct me if I'm wrong, there's been a broader conversation happening as a result of the submarine contract bids in terms of Canada's relationships with Europe and NATO countries, alongside the relationships with Asian countries in terms of defense. How do you see Canada's engagement in the future in terms of with Asian countries for defense partnerships? And also if there is political will to engage in both strengthening our relationship with NATO, but also with countries in Asia.
When the question was asked earlier about the submarines and sort of looking for an opinion on which would be of interest, I was thinking that at that time I might speak up, but I will now, that Canada has some interests in the Asia Pacific, of course, in the Indo-Pacific. And those interests are only going to increase, I suspect, over time. And not that the interest in Europe will decrease, not that our interest in NATO will decrease, but the Indo-Pacific, the center of global commerce, of many things are shifting towards the Indo-Pacific, and that's going to become increasingly important to Canada. Canada has just recently announced the appointment of a very senior officer to Manila to represent Canada's defense interests in the area. There are only 2 other officers serving outside Canada permanently of that rank. One's in Belgium and the other's in Colorado Springs. And Korea? Sorry, might be missing one. And so the notion is that the importance of the Indo-Pacific is only going to increase for Canada. Maybe the answer is a diversification in submarines as well. Maybe that makes sense, but we're not in a position as a nation or as a military to start playing that game yet. We're limited in how much we can diversify our forces at the moment in terms of capabilities, just because of the people problem and the money problem associated with that. So I think it's in Canada's interests. It's in our interest as a trading nation to reinforce our connections to the Indo-Pacific, and that's only going to increase certainly over the life of the submarine project.
And I can say for us that's true too, right? I mean, the German Navy is regularly present in the Indo-Pacific, much more than it used to be. We have an Indo-Pacific strategy. TKMS has Indo-Pacific customers. India soon, by the way, a fleet that will be built only in India. Singapore, the maintenance hub in Singapore, we negotiated with the Singaporeans the option for it to open for Canadian submarines in the future. So we fully understand the importance of the Indo-Pacific, and we actually share that. So then the gentleman behind.
Hi, Fraser Mackay. I'm an analyst at D&D. Each of you in your comments has touched a little bit on the importance of building and maintaining Canadian public support for increased defense funding, increased defense procurements, and so on. And we've seen in some ways a great deal of public interest. The fact that we have sort of a national debate on the procurement of a fighter we haven't really seen that since the 1960s. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit as to what you would recommend as sort of the best ways to build the Canadian public's awareness and support for defense issues. Thank you.
Maybe here's a good moment to make a pitch for University of Ottawa and, of course, Carleton to have these kinds of events on a regular basis, because I think the more Canadians understand about what the military is doing for them and the civilians in national defense are doing for them, they realize the importance of the work and, in fact, the essential nature of the work. The other good way of telling the interest of Canadians and the familiarity with the kinds of things that we do all day are the numbers around recruitment. And maybe if I back up, not just who we actually recruit, but the numbers of applicants. And those numbers, as everyone knows, are through the roof. And they go higher the more that Canadians know that the military will be well equipped, that they will have uniforms that fit, that they will have weapons that work, that they will have kit that will meet the capability requirements and that will enable us to meet our readiness targets. So all of the public communications that we make around all of the acquisitions, but just the day-to-day lives of what it is we do as civilians and military across Canada and around the world. I think that really helps to make a difference. And maybe one thing that I've always found amusing is not the right word. We used to be a big peacekeeping nation. My secret hope is that when we get up to the strength that would permit it, we could go back to doing a lot more of that kind of work. It is a very Canadian thing to do. We haven't been able to do that very much over the last couple of decades because we simply don't have enough people to undertake that sort of work. But maybe in the future.
I'll do a bit of a hat tip to something else that Thomas works on, namely transparency and national security. I think one of the key steps that's going to happen is that there needs to be a sea change in government culture around transparency around some of this. How many times has an announcement been made about defense funding, and you don't really have clarity about where the money is going exactly, and that's kind of like elemental stuff, right? If you're going to be spending $150 billion a year, you have to be much better at explaining where it's going and being more honest about this project isn't going so well. This is why it may need to be stopped or canceled or changed, or this one is progressing better. And I don't think it's malicious. I think there's part of it is just the lack of capacity to be producing that amount of material and to getting it out there and all the rest of it. I totally get it. But at the same time, if we want people on board, I think we do need to do here in Ottawa in particular a better job of kind of detailing where your money is going, why it is doing what it's supposed to be doing, so that you don't end up surprised or with scandals or other things like that, where there's suddenly, an attack or something that looks like an arrived can situation or whatever it is. And I'll just give a quick anecdote on this because I think it's material. So when we did the fighter review in 2012, 2014, we did everything we did was just put on the website. Every meeting that we had, everything that we did was just on the website. And you know what was interesting about that? Nobody cared. Why? Because it was on the website. So these fine gentlemen here, if it's on the website, it's not a story. Right? You're not gonna, it's already there. Like anybody can find it. Who cares? Right? Academics love it because we can talk about it and look into the details, but it becomes a bit of a non-story when it's on the website. So, are we making an effort to actually make this transparent to Canadians where they can say, yeah, this is interesting. I want to know where the money's going, where it's being spent. Tools like that, particularly in an age of AI, I don't need Claude to, be doing targeting for me necessarily, but I sure would be nice to have something tell me, how much is being spent, where it's going, and to have an easy search portal so that if I have questions, I can have access to it.
It's a bit of a chicken and an egg in my mind. The public isn't really, apart from 150 people in this room, the public doesn't seem to show an awful lot of interest in matters of foreign policy, defense, and security. It peaked a little bit recently because of our challenges on the economic side and trade war, but Canadians generally don't seem to be very interested. And so how interested is their government as well? So does the government have to be more forthright with Canadians about the conditions of the world? Many of you here have probably traveled like I do to Europe and other areas where threat perceptions are much different than they are here in Canada. And it's easy for people that are living in the same time zone as their threat to take it seriously. And the ambassador has talked about sort of the view in Germany of defense investment. And so I think, how does the government appropriately connect with Canadians on the reasons for defense, the reasons for security, and what the threats are out there? So I think that would be part one. Part two, if I just take another moment, I think another way to help is to allow defense to start to increase that dialogue between Canadians and their defense, is to allow Canadian defense to engage with industry. And so for my military career, it was really difficult for us in uniform to engage with Canadian industry for lots of government reasons, but it wasn't very helpful to us to create the dialogue and the awareness and to keep things front and center.
So we have 5 minutes left. I will collect 3 questions and then let the panel answer collectively. So the gentleman here in the front, then there, and then there in the back.
Thank you. Ernest Gilman, longtime retiree from DND. One of the programs I was in charge of or coordinating was our links to universities, where we gave X amount of money and the universities could do whatever they wanted with it, as long as we were talking about security. D&D got rid of that program. Not enough money. Lack of communication. I'm a historian, so I'll go back in history and to the first Trudeau administration. Pierre Trudeau wanted to do certain things within NATO. And part of that was also a peace plan, a world peace plan. And government, foreign affairs and defense sent out people to talk to the public. Haven't done that in years. That wasn't what I was going to actually bring up. What I was going to mention was the things that we've just discussed for the last hour are pretty formidable. Do we have an educational system that can handle such challenges? Or do we have to start thinking about that also? Thank you.
Thank you. Important question. The other 2, please keep it short so that we can have the answers. So one was the row behind, or 2 rows behind, I think.
Thank you all. My name is Tasneem Gedi. I'm at the University of Ottawa, Master of Security and Defense. So Canada has historically avoided articulating a grand strategy. Does this conversation about defense industrial strategy kind of force that into being at this moment? And what does this moment mean 50, 100 years down the line?
And the last question over there. The gentleman in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Amadou Sidi Diallo, analyst with the Canada School of Public Service. What worries me is the potential return to nuclear proliferation. So what's your take on, for instance, Germany, I think, maybe is thinking about that possibility because the umbrella, France's umbrella or UK's umbrella, nuclear umbrella won't suffice. I don't know, but Russia is threatening. And as for Canada, what's our, I don't know, where do we stand in terms of nuclear leadership? Are we going to maybe I don't know, possess one because we have the technology to do so. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to the panel. Please feel free to answer whichever of the questions or some of them.
I'll just make a very quick one on the university one. What was really interesting to me, for instance, was the Canada Research Impact Chairs, which we're trying to get international people to come back to Canada. They were almost exclusively kind of on the STEM side of the defense equation. And at Carleton, we said, okay, well, how about a defense economist? There's like 2 of them left in the country. One of them's about to retire. Do we know anybody that can crunch some of these numbers? And initially, the federal government said, no, we're not interested in that. Right? So part of it is STEM at the university level. And I think on the submarine one, just the amount of investment that's going to happen or need to happen for us to actually have 12 submarines, like it's difficult for us to wrap our head around in terms of the engineering capacity, the physics, all the rest of it. It's going to be huge. But we shouldn't, this is very self-serving, we shouldn't ignore the social scientific piece to this of like, if you want polling data, if you want people who understand comms, if you want people who understand defense industry, defense economics, like that whole side of it is being seen as kind of the soft stuff that we can ignore. when in reality, as the conversation, a number of people have asked about public support. Like you're going to have that other side, and that hasn't really been funded sufficiently yet.
I think we're in or entering. So the world has changed. Canada hasn't quite yet. Where a security consciousness, a security culture, and a security awareness isn't optional anymore. So we're entering a time when we have to be able to be literate about matters of security. And so whether that's the educational component that was part of the first question, or a grand strategy, the part of the second question, I think Canada has to get to the point where we're being a little bit more serious than we have been about the need for this as a national requirement. And so, yes, all of those things need to be addressed. Nuclear proliferation, there's somebody else in the room more qualified than me to talk about that, and maybe he'll mention that later.
Thinking the same thing on the nuclear proliferation. But I can assure you that as of January 28th, we had no plans to acquire nuclear missile technology. That we had other stuff to do, basically. Really interesting point on the future of education in relation to all of the investments coming into Canada. I think the Prime Minister has already made it clear that we need investments in the trades. We also very much need investments in those who will be able to deliver for Canada on the defense production side. And it can be some pretty specific technological requirements as well as educational. So you got your work cut out for you there as well. The other larger piece I think we'll be able to address with the next panel as well. A national security strategy has been discussed in Canada for some time. Defense is a part of that, but I think, as you all know, if there is a war underway right now in Canada, it's a cyber war. And that is really where we need to spend a lot of time and energy in strengthening our defenses. And again, I think the next panel will be able to talk about that too. Well, thank you.
But just very quickly, because there was a question on Germany as well in terms of the nuclear proliferation piece. No, our nuclear arrangement, as with the whole of Europe, except for the two nuclear powers, is under NATO and an extended deterrence type of option. That's not going to change. What is changing is that there is more cooperation now, for example, with France in terms of for the first time starting to exercise together in that realm as well. So that you see, it doesn't mean we have any doubts as to the credibility of the nuclear deterrence of NATO, and we'll certainly do anything we can in order to make sure that stays the way it is now. Thank you very much to all our three panelists. This was very exciting and interesting, and I think we really covered a lot of ground here. Please give a round of applause. And we are on time.
Just quickly, before we move to the break, I want to thank Phil for bringing up the issue of transparency, which is one of the issues that I focus on a lot. I'm sure you appreciated that too. I think it does matter directly in terms of a discussion on diversification as we're having today, in the sense that diversification of our defense partnerships on the procurement side, on other sides, intelligence cooperation, as we'll talk about after the break as well, it involves choices, it involves priority setting. This is something that Canada has not done very well over the decades. We've had a bit of a tradition to sprinkle our diplomatic efforts all over the place, avoiding a lot of these more difficult choices, but the inevitability of making some of these more difficult choices will lead to controversies. It will involve saying no on subs, on fighter aircraft, on other issues, to partners, to allies, to friends. And the lack of transparency that has also been a bit of a Canadian tradition on a lot of these issues comes at a cost, in the sense of getting additional buy-in from the population, justifying these expenses, justifying the $150 billion mentioned several times, but also building the trust in the government that is essential as a first line of defense for a lot of the threats that we face today, where yes, there's a military component, but there's also a societal resilience component to a lot of the threats we face today. And on that level, greater engagement, greater transparency is an essential tool that we are not using well enough. And that has a direct link to the conversation we were having today. So thank you for bringing that up. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bellman, for agreeing to chair the session. session brilliantly today, so we much appreciate that. Okay, so we will start with our keynote address right away. Just as a quick reminder on the logistics, the keynote is from 3 to 3:45. There is no break after the keynote, and we will be jumping directly to the other session focused on intelligence. So our speakers for the last session, just as a reminder, that at 3:45 you can come directly in front and there will be no break. We will move directly to our second and last panel after that. So for our keynote, we are extremely lucky and grateful to have with us the former Chief of the Defense Staff, General Wayne Eyre. I think everybody here knows him, so I will not read the very long bio that you have on our website. I would simply mention that General Eyre, in addition to keeping himself extremely busy in retirement, writing a memoir, but also he teaches with us at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and I think that actually we have in the room today some students who took his defense policy class last fall. And he's also a senior fellow with us at the graduate school. So on that, we will move directly to your talk. So thank you very much.
Well, Thomas, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation et pour l'introduction. It's great to see everybody here, experts in the field, former colleagues, students. Hey, just a show of hands, how many students we have here? Excellent. That's great to see. You know, you, both current practitioners, experts, and students, you're the foundation of what I like to call the defense intellectual base. We talk a lot about the defense industrial base, but related to a question from last session, thinking about defense and security, talking about it and increasing the literacy in our country is so important. So thank you for doing that. Because there is no doubt that these are highly consequential times and they demand a different way to think about the situation that we're in. Different actions to take to ensure the future success of our country. So I'm going to talk about a few things in this keynote. I'm going to frame the current security environment, which will lead to what Canada needs to do about it, which will lead to the subject of this talk, which is about diversifying our relationships around the world. And then we can get into the good stuff, the Q&A, and take the conversation wherever you want to go. So into it. You know, throughout history, it has been common in times of profound transition to label the current era as without precedent, as being more dangerous than ever before. And that has happened time and again by those who are constrained by a narrow view of history. And they may have been right for their various eras. But I argue that now we live in a truly unprecedented age because of the confluence of a number of stressors in the security environment occurring simultaneously and each acting on the other. Geopolitical reordering, climate change, acceleration in the rate of technological change, and social change. And there's more that will play on it. But let me unpack each of those in turn and how they will impact our diversification. So for geopolitical reordering, you know, if we take a look at the last half millennial or so, or even the long history of large human organizations, there's been a cycle in human organization. Order, disorder, reorder. And I, like many, in February of 2022, following Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, argued that we have to uphold that rules-based international order. Now, this order, set up in the ashes of the Second World War by those who had witnessed such devastation and destruction, unparalleled in human history, set up norms and institutions to stop great power conflict. And although far from perfect, regional wars still happened, crises and calamities still happened. We haven't seen great power conflict since 1945. But ladies and gentlemen, I now believe that order is a thing of the past. Its guardrails are disintegrating. Its norms of territorial sovereignty, a people's right to exist, and avoiding nuclear saber rattling, and we just saw some of that out of Russia over the last few days, are being discarded by authoritarian rulers intent on remaking the world order in their image. You know, China wants to remake the order with them at the center, restoring the Middle Kingdom, if you will. Russia wants to regain its mythical empire, even as it crumbles from within. And contributing to putting a nail in the coffin of this order is the US retreat from virtuous leadership, with violations of established norms leading to uncertainty and diminishing the credibility of key alliances. And that includes perhaps a retreat from their practice of securing the global commons, a key feature of the last order. So I believe that 2022 marked a turning point in that global order. And you could argue if it started in 2014 or if it started in January of 2025. But regardless, we are well into it. And what the US has been doing over the last year has been an accelerant to that turning point. And so we are now in the disorder phase of global reordering, or as our Prime Minister has put it, a rupture. And periods of transition are periods of high risk as the world seeks a new equilibrium. Former norms of behavior no longer hold. And that risk is even higher with authoritarian leaders, in many cases self-styled as men of history and destiny, who want to accomplish certain things in their lifetime, surrounded by yes men, meaning that contrary views are not welcome, which only escalates the opportunities for miscalculation. And there's historical precedents. I just finished a book yesterday called The Coming Storm by Yale's Odd Wedstad, comparing our current age to the age immediately prior to the First World War, and how that environment was and is rife for unintended and surprising escalation. And moreover, he discusses how these authoritarians can be overwhelmed by that combination of hubris and fear that has so often produced war in the past. They perceive, or they fear, the perception of weakness more than they fear the consequences of war. And today we see these authoritarian leaders and states wanting to remake global rules and norms to better serve their interests. Some are arguing for spheres of influence. So we got to realize that confrontational geopolitics is nothing new in history. We just had a break from it during the so-called unipolar moment of 1990 to 2020, when we put history on pause. Well, ladies and gentlemen, history has returned. And we got to be worried, because throughout that long arc of history, borders have been temporary, even ours, and especially in the Arctic, which are relatively recent constructs, especially when you take a look at the millennia of human history. And that geopolitical reordering brings other stressors as well, such as economic fragmentation and changes in human migration. But it's also really exacerbated by the second factor I want to talk about, and that is climate change. And having the long view here is important as well, because we as humans have gone through climate change before. And throughout much of our history, the threshold of survivability was only 1 or 2 degrees average change. Well, now we're facing much more of that. And it's a driver of migration around the world, fueling conflict, exacerbating global reordering. And we see it here at home with the frequency and intensity of natural disasters. And it's nowhere more profound than what we see in the Arctic, with accompanying security implications. You know, thirdly is the technological change acceleration. And it's likewise having an incredible impact on the security environment. The pace of change is already unrivaled in human history and only accelerating. We've seen the impact of the extraterritorial nature of the internet, autonomous systems, the rise of cyber and space domains, not only what they mean for civilization writ large, but for military operations as well. Persistent surveillance and long-range strike capabilities have deepened the battlefield. The adaptation battle, which was discussed a little bit in the last panel, means the cycle and the change of character of war is faster than ever before. And we are potentially on the brink of game-changing technologies such as artificial general intelligence, human enhancements through biotechnology, quantum computing that will greatly shape the future. And they are fueling a geopolitical tech arms race and confrontation over complicated supply chains, especially as all are underpinned by critical minerals. And we only need to look at China's dominance here and their lock on clean energy as an example. But it's also fueling novel ways of conflict in the form of hybrid attacks, below the threshold of wide-scale violence, such as cable cutting, drone attacks, cyber attacks, foreign interference, attacks on infrastructure, all contributing to a society's loss of confidence. And speaking of society, societal change is the fourth one I want to talk about. And arguably, we have seen more societal change in our own country in the last decade than we have in the last half century combined. Demographics, norms, expectations are all changing. And this is the same around the world, especially in developed countries, as we see shrinking populations here at home, in Europe, in China, for example. The way that people form opinions, the way they engage with institutions, and the way they interpret events is also evolving quickly. In security terms, this matters because the nature of conflict, the nature of war is not changing. It has been and always will be a contest of human will. But what has changed is how wars are being conducted and how that human will is being affected. Adversaries today do not need to defeat armies. They can also try to divide societies, inflame mistrust, and exploit existing tensions. Through disinformation, manipulation, and what is often called cognitive warfare, they seek to widen fractures that already exist. Political, cultural, generational, or economic, and to persuade people that decline is inevitable and democratic systems are incapable of responding. We see it here in Canada with the People's Republic of China interfering in our elections, with Russia propagating disinformation on Ukraine, on vaccinations, and now Alberta separatism. And we see it with the rise of anti-Semitism and other hate-based ideologies fueled by hateful disinformation on social media such as TikTok. And these four, and there's others out there such as economic fragmentation, these four make for very many possible future scenarios, making the future very uncertain. And it makes it difficult to consider what the future could possibly look like. One way is scenario planning. About a month ago, Hal Brands, a renowned American geostrategist, had a great article in Foreign Policy magazine where he did some future scenario planning. And he talked about three possibilities for the emerging world order. One, a G2, where you've got two blocks, one centered on the US, one centered on China, almost akin to the Cold War. Another with numerous spheres of influence that pop up, regional empires, if you will. And yet again, another, a self-help world where US behavior turns very predatory and the system plunges into anarchy, every country for itself. And there are others out there. But it's a useful frame to think about the future and some commonalities for Canada. And so what does all this mean for Canada? How do we prepare for these multiple possibilities? Many of our comfortable assumptions have been upended. There's extreme implications for our country. Our vital national security interests, prosperity, sovereignty, protecting our population, are going to be under even more threat in the years ahead. And you may question why I put prosperity at the top of the list when I'm talking about national security. Well, without prosperity, it's hard to secure ourselves. And so it's a symbiotic relationship. And our prosperity as a trading nation is predicated on enough stability and certainty in the international order, created in large part through collective deterrence of adventurism, expansionism, and aggression by rogue powers. And we need to do our part to maintain this stability and certainty. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, coupled with other musings out there, has shown that national borders are no longer inviolate. Our own long-term sovereignty, especially in the Arctic, is based on upholding this norm. So in the playground of international affairs, weakness invites bullies, and that's the ability to exercise credible military control over our own territory, and the approaches to it will play upon the decision calculus of anybody, anyone, any country, any state that would seek to do us harm. So in other words, it's deterrence. We need to be wary, however, of overcommitting in the Arctic, of fixing too much of our force structure in place. That's why a combination of all-domain awareness, sensors from space to the seabed, to give us early warning of threats to and on the approaches to our country, giving us time to react, and then constructing these northern operational support hubs where we can project capabilities from the south to respond in a timely manner. And that's going to be important to be able to find balance in our domestic and international responsibilities. So doing our part internationally is going to continue to be important. So in this age of uncertainty, we have to hedge against many possible future scenarios. And that includes increased self-reliance, a security-minded citizenry, a diverse mesh of friends, partners, and allies, and a renewed focus on hard power. And we got to realize that the currency of international relations is now just that, hard power. If we want a seat at the table to help shape the emerging order, or even to be able to whisper in the ear with somebody with a seat at that table, we need strength. And this country's recent commitment to substantially increase defense investment is the right move. Although as a guy arguing it at the time, I would say it's late to need, but good nonetheless. It's late because it's going to take time to implement. And given the looming threats, we can't dawdle. And the peacetime processes that we currently have in place are not going to get us there. The times demand a wartime mentality, like we had in 1939, like we had in 1914. And as alluded to in the last panel, one of Canada's greatest strategic vulnerabilities is not a lack of talent or resources. It's the challenge of sustaining national will over time, helping citizens understand why these investments matter, why resilience matters, and why security cannot be treated as somebody else's responsibility. Government needs the social license to continue. That's why education and public literacy in defense and security are so essential. A democratic society must bring its people along with it if it expects to act with consistency and with resolve. And that's why the job of many of you as educators and influencers is just so important. That's why earlier this spring, I jumped at the offer to provide the opening keynote to the Harvard Model UN last Friday in Toronto, and to share my perspective with 1,200 very keen high school and university students. They were super engaged, almost as much as my own students last fall. And as I spent the morning walking around to the various sessions and asking many thoughtful questions, I was inspired. Well, perhaps with the exception of the one asking me if I was a veteran of the Second World War. Not that old. So I want to change gears now and just focus on the topic of this session, and that's diversifying our mesh of friends, partners, and allies. And here it's going to be a very fine balancing act. You know, given the tremendous uncertainty in front of us, and as mentioned, the many possible future scenarios, for us, like every other country, we're going to have to respond in what's in our best interests to when faced with crises and challenges. Alliances, as I mentioned, are underpinned by trust and certainty. And given current circumstances, that is somewhat lacking. And so as part of our hedging strategy, we need to deepen and broaden an array of like or like enough minded friends, partners, and allies around the world to address the crisis or the issue at hand. And our Prime Minister has called this variable geometry. And to do it requires upfront investing in those relationships to grease the skids of cooperation when required. And that means we need to engage. And to do that requires engagement capacity. And here we're going to be really challenged, at least in the short term. And again, some of my thunder was stolen by the last panel on this. But from a military perspective, it means combined exercises, training, courses, visits, and placing sufficiently talented attachés in key countries. And on the last point, as we rebuild the armed forces, sufficient mid-level leadership is a critical shortfall, and it's got to be very carefully managed. And as also mentioned above, balancing our commitments domestically to the Arctic, internationally, is going to be a fine balancing act as well. And at the same time, we have to engage diplomatically to form those deep regional and country-specific knowledge and relationships. And I would argue cutting diplomats is not the way to do it. We should be going in the other direction. And we have to engage deeply in other sectors such as trade, academia, and research, and really form those institution-institution relationships. So that current lack of engagement capacity that we have is really going to limit our options. And we can't be all things to all countries. So we need to prioritize. And in doing so, we got to balance our values and our interests. We need a realistic assessment as to what is within the art of the possible. I would argue that maintaining the transatlantic link is at the top of the list. We need to continue to deepen relationships with European powers, including the Nordics, with whom we have many shared interests and values. But equally important, and perhaps shaped by my time stationed there, we need to build relationships with with key Indo-Pacific players. Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, Taiwan, and India, among others, really come to mind. And for the rest of the world, we need to view it as economy of effort. You know, that doesn't mean no effort. It means we just need to be very, very targeted in the expenditure of this very precious engagement capacity. For the so-called great powers, you know, they're not going away. We need to coexist with them, but do so from a position strong enough to ensure our interests. And that means strengthening our strategic autonomy and independence, which are not binary concepts, to have enough not to sacrifice what is truly important and what we hold dear as we coexist with these great powers. We need to be wary about siding with China over the US, as I believe that is the path to ruin. And on that, we must not blindly discard existing alliances, especially with the US, even as that relationship becomes more transactional. You know, despite our current differences, we have far more in common with the US than we do with China. And we cannot pivot completely away. The geography matters. And so with that reality, we need to be careful about burning bridges with those who are still friendly, about evoking wide-scale nationalism by not considering the population separate from the administration, by booing national anthems at hockey games, and turning those who are friendly to us against us. And we got to remember, there are more Americans friendly to Canada than there are Canadians. But it's still going to be challenged. And that relationship has changed. And I, for one, do not believe it will go back to where it was or where we thought it was. And so to coexist, I believe we need to make ourselves as indispensable as possible. And so what does that look like? So in the Arctic, especially in that vital 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock position on the continental arc, making ourselves an indispensable partner in terms of domain awareness. What does that look like in terms of energy? What does that look like in terms of critical minerals, and especially in processing capacity? And in certain tech sectors, such as sensors, aerospace, and quantum. That concept of indispensable partner could be extended to others as well, as we take a look at the increased focus on maritime choke points, and perhaps the U.S. pulling back from securing the global commons. We've awakened, or the U.S. has awakened something in Iran. They don't need nukes. They've got a much more powerful weapon in terms of their ability to control the Strait of Hormuz. And that lesson, I fear, is going to be taken aboard by other powers. And those maritime choke points could become very critical vulnerabilities for certain countries. But what can we do to help them out? Take a look at Japan, who is very dependent on stuff going through numerous maritime choke points. Not many maritime choke points between the British Columbia coast and Japan, direct line. Again, geography matters. And here we can exploit our position. Back to the U.S. At the same time, as part of our hedge, along with other partners around the world, from a military perspective, along with other perspectives, we need to continue to invest in relationships. I've seen firsthand the benefits of a strong, multi-decade military-to-military relationships. In the very uncertain future we face, perhaps having the ability in 10 or 20 years for a senior leader to pick up the phone and talk to a U.S. counterpart about a very sensitive issue is going to be of national benefit. Especially if you've got shared experiences, shared hardships around the world. It could be a benefit to our country. And so we need to continue to invest in relationships like that with the U.S. and with other countries as well. And I could go on and tell you all sorts of stories about my time as a CDS and being able to pick up the phone and having those sensitive discussions with partners around the world. So I've left you with a few things. And in conclusion, I just want to reiterate that we've entered a much more dangerous, unpredictable world, one where more possible partners are going to be better, but also one in which we need to do much more ourselves. And I would argue that Canada is much better placed than most nations in the world to deal with it and to come out better on the other side. Let's use this moment not to wallow in crisis, but to reach for opportunity. We have work to do, but I believe we can do it. And having seen many of the alternatives in hotspots around the world, I believe that Canada is worth it. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. That was great. So we have just under 15 minutes for Q&A. So please ask a reasonably short question, introduce yourself, and the General Eyre will answer. Steve?
Except for Steve.
Except for Steve. Just for that, we'll start with Steve.
Thanks for coming out today, General. I really appreciate your talk. I'm curious. I keep on hearing people talk about how things are just hunky-dory at the mill-to-mill level. And I wonder, now that you're no longer at CDS, how would you feel if you were having to pick up the phone and call the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for something when you know the chairman was chosen because he was a white man who said he loved Donald Trump? And how do you make that relationship work when the person on the other end is a thoroughly politicized general?
I have tremendous sympathy for U.S. colleagues because I believe they're facing perhaps their worst crisis in political military relations since perhaps the Civil War. I served with or knew 2/3 of the 3- and 4-star generals that were relieved. Combat experienced, well proven, strong leaders, great people, and so even though those who are currently filling the roles might be the greatest of leaders themselves, there's going to be some taint, and it's going to take some time to get through this. What I hear, and I still try to stay engaged as much as possible, especially with our people who are in exchange positions, is many of the American leaders over top of them are doing their best to shield our exchange and liaison staff from the din of politics. But at the end of the day, we respond to our political masters. And this is why I believe it's going to continue to be a challenge. We need to be down there, eyes wide open. But at the same time, we need to try to continue to develop those relationships because they are so valuable going forward. It's not all clean and nice. There is still that you can't get away from it. You can't get away from the evening news and to see what is happening. And military professionalism has got to take them as far as possible.
A question in the middle on the side. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Scott Simon at the University of Ottawa. I'm also senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I want to thank you for a wonderful talk. I wanted to zone in on focus on one question here because I agree with you 100% on those Indo-Pacific partners. And I think one of the most important ones is Taiwan. But how do we balance that with the desire to have a strategic partnership with China, which sees any modest relationship with Taiwan as being a red line?
Yeah, we got to be very careful about sacrificing our relationship with Taiwan to have an improved relationship with China. I bristled when I heard the comment, strategic partnership. We got to coexist. Having some trade is good. But doing it from a position where we're not sacrificing our national interests and national values has got to be the way forward. Because if we go all in, we'll have our lunch eaten for us very, very fast. We've got to be eyes wide open as we go into a relationship like that.
Right behind the first question. Yeah. Thank you.
General, I agree with you. I think that we do have to look at the situation in terms of creating a wartime mentality. But remember, the last time we went through something like this, we actually had one person in charge of everything, particularly industry, and he happened to be an American. So are you thinking in terms of, do we need somebody like that? And is there somebody here rather than do we have to look again down south?
So it depends what historical analogy you're using. Who's the one person you're talking about?
C.D. Howe.
Yeah, I thought you were talking about C.D. Howe. In fact, I'd recommend to you The Dollar a Year Men, the book about him and his industrialists that were brought in. Even despite where he was born, I would argue that he was a patriot at heart and did the right thing. Hey, we're living in an environment where we have to be comfortable taking much more risk. And that means on the procurement side, on the policy side, of being comfortable with an 80% solution or 80% certainty of success. Yeah, it's going to fail 2 out of 10 times, but that's the price of doing business. And we got to change the culture to one where risk is eliminated. Well, financial, reputational, legal risk is eliminated at the price of operational and strategic risk, which goes through the roof because we look at risk in stovepipes. No, we've got to welcome that innovation, that entrepreneurial spirit, where we're willing to take smart risk, but when we fail, it has to be embraced as a learning opportunity. Unless it's a failure of negligence, then hammer individuals, not group punishment, but look at it as a learning opportunity and continue to iterate rapidly like that. That is not in our culture, either from a military procurement side or the wider government ecosystem. That's where that mentality needs to change.
Hi, I'm Marie-Ève Bégin. I'm a master's student and also an intern at GAC for the summer. Thank you so much for sharing. So I was wondering, you've talked a lot about balance, and a term that's very in vogue right now in government is autonomy, strategic autonomy. Sorry for my English. I was wondering how you see this autonomy playing out in practice when it comes to defense, security, and supply chain issues. Like, should we focus more on vertical integration within Canada or continue to build global supply chains now that we've seen that even our allies can turn against us? Thank you.
So great question. And I'm going to unpack this one a little bit. And I would argue there's actually two components to this. There's strategic autonomy, which is the ability of us as a country to make decisions on our own, absent or not bowing to pressure from others. And then there's strategic independence, our ability to conduct operations by ourselves, unilaterally. Given our situation, it's not going to be total. It's not going to be 100%. And we have to decide how much is enough, how much autonomy, and autonomy is related to independence, how much of that is required. From a military perspective on the independence side, it would be a useful practice to identify what mission sets we need to be able to do ourselves and invest accordingly in those capabilities. From an autonomy perspective, what type of questions do we want to be able to answer ourselves? And then what sort of international support do we need to garner to be able to do that? This is where the art of statecraft comes in. And statecraft, especially in today's world, as I mentioned in the speech, is going to be underpinned by hard power. And so, exactly where we're going to be on that autonomy scale, I can't say at this point. But again, it comes down to we do go up higher when we have more friends, partners, and allies that we can count on and group together with for an issue at hand.
Hi, Jessica Feeney, one of the General's previous students. So with the current limited budget within Canada, where do you think the balance exists between diplomatic and military investments?
You never asked that type of hard question in class. So you need both. And Jim Mattis, famously, General Jim Mattis, when he was U.S. Secretary of Defense in the first Trump administration, famously said that if you're going to cut the budget for the Department of State, you better invest more in my ammunition budget, because you need both, and they need to work together, closely together. And I've sometimes said that our best foreign policy tool is our military, but you need diplomats who understand it and can talk about it in international circles. And so investing in both, not asymmetrically as we see now with one increasing and the other being cut, is the way to go. Coupled with that, we need to develop deep multi-department expertise, mainly centered on GAC, but a few others in certain regions and countries in the world, China in particular. We need China experts in language, culture, strategic culture, economics, to be able to understand the threat ahead.
You mentioned quickly GAC and D&D need to work together. you use the word need how would you assess the current state of interagency, interdepartmental cooperation to do everything that you've been talking about? What more could be done to make it better?
So I can only speak from my experience as CDS, and so I'm approaching 2 years out of date. But I will say, during that time, that relationship was actually very good. Excellent cooperation at the DG ADM, and I was in good contact at the DM level on a regular basis. And it also helped to have DM counterpart DM experts with deep experience in global affairs, and so that worked out well. But you're dealing with different cultures, and having strategic empathy, where you can put yourself in the shoes of the other department and understand their perspective, incredibly important as well. One of the concerns I see right now with the asymmetry of budgets, and going back to Tasneem's question, is, okay, more money's coming to defense, other departments are being cut. How many other departments are going to try to attach their cart to the defense horse and see defense as a slush fund to fund their own programs, especially when they can't do it themselves? So that's something that's real. And having seen just how much bandwidth is consumed in cuts, 2023, when we had $1 billion taken out of the O&M budget for defense, how much staff horsepower we had consumed in that exercise to find out where the cuts needed to come from at the expense of planning for the future. I'm kind of worried about that the entire ecosystem and where horsepower is being applied.
With apologies for the couple extra hands I saw, it is 3:45 and we do have to move on to the last session. So I do apologize for the few people I saw. So if you can join me in thanking General Eyre for a great keynote speech.
Good afternoon, everyone. Merci, Thomas. Thank you, General. A very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Alexandra Ghiuci. I'm Director of CIPS. It is my privilege to welcome all of you to the second panel of today's event. And I think you will agree with me that there can be no better way to build on the excellent keynote address that we just heard than with a discussion on national security and intelligence featuring 3 outstanding speakers. I am truly honored that they have been able to join us today. They all have extremely distinguished backgrounds. I couldn't possibly do justice to their CVs, so I will introduce them very, very briefly, also in the interest of maximizing the time we have for our discussion. I will start in alphabetical order, although this is not the order in which they will speak. So let me start with Kerry Buck, Senior Fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, who was, upon her retirement from the Canadian Public Service, Assistant Secretary in Economic Sector at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. Prior to that appointment, as many of you know, she was Canada's ambassador to the North Atlantic Council, that is at NATO. She held senior executive positions at Global Affairs Canada, including that of Political Director and Assistant Deputy Minister for International Security and Political Affairs. Outside of GAC, Kerry served, among other positions, in the Privy Council office. Welcome, Kerry. Thank you all so much. Thank you for coming. Jodie Thomas. Jodie Thomas retired in 2024 after more than 40 years in the federal government. Upon retirement, she was National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. She was previously the Deputy Minister of National Defense, as well as Commissioner of the Canadian Coast Guard. Thank you so much, Jodie, for being here today. Last but most certainly not least, we are delighted to welcome David Vigneault, who is the Chief Intelligence Officer for Strider Technologies. David supports engagement with private and public sector entities and advances research and development efforts within the intelligence team. Prior to this appointment, he was Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CIPS. Thank you all so much for agreeing to share your expertise with us. We look forward to your presentations, and perhaps I will invite David to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. I have invited each of our speakers to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes on the theme of the conference, and then we'll open it up for questions. So please prepare your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here in Ottawa with so many of you. Je vais parler en anglais, je vais faire ma présentation en anglais, mais évidemment, j'espère qu'on va avoir l'opportunité de parler un petit peu en français par la suite. So this topic is very close to my heart. I've spent about 28 years in government working in national security defense. I started my career in that building over there. And I was just reminding Dr. Ernie Gilman, who asked a couple of the questions this afternoon, is the one who made the strategic mistake of hiring me in 1996. So it goes back some time now. But I also in intelligence, I had the opportunity to collect intelligence, to produce intelligence, to coordinate the intelligence function, the PCO, and finally to also be at CSIS for the last 7+ years. And so this is something that I'm very keen to discuss with all of you and have an open discussion. So I'm going to go through mostly, we're going to read my notes. That is going to go a bit faster than if I just try to follow and diverge and get a bit confused like I would normally do. So when we talk about Canada's intelligence partnerships, we of course talk very often, and as of today, about diversification. And so the argument for diversification, of course, seems very straightforward. The world is becoming more complex, and I think General Ayer did a tremendous job of showing us, talking to us, and using good examples to describe that. The power is becoming more diffuse. The center of gravity of geopolitical competition is shifting, and therefore Canada should diversify its intelligence and security partnerships. So those are arguments I fundamentally agree with. But diversification is much easier to advocate than to implement. The real questions are, in my view, diversify from whom, diversify with whom, for what purpose, and what are we prepared to invest in return. Canada begins from a position of considerable strength. We are a founding member of the Five Eyes partnerships, arguably the most successful intelligence alliance in history. That relationship provides Canada with extraordinary access, trust, and insight. So the objective should not be to the diversification away from Five Eyes. It should be diversification beyond Five Eyes. And that distinction matters. I would be pleased, of course, to talk about the elephant in the room, the implications of a Trump presidency, both at the current moment and for the longer-term strategic landscape. So I'm happy to speak to that in the discussion afterwards. Over the course of my career, the most significant change I have observed, however, is not simply the evolution of threats, but the expansion of what we now consider national security. The first reason is that the nature of intelligence itself is changing. Historically, intelligence services focus primarily on military threats, terrorism, espionage, and state intentions. Those issues, of course, remain very important today. But today, national security increasingly encompasses economic security, critical technologies, supply chains, artificial intelligence, foreign interference, critical minerals, and cyber resilience. The intelligence questions governments are being asked to answer are broader than they were 20 years ago. CSIS 2025 annual report comes to the same conclusion. And that reality requires broader networks. The second reason is that many of the countries developing expertise in these areas are not necessarily our traditional intelligence partners. Some of the most innovative thinking on economic security is emerging from Europe. Countries such as France, Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands are investing heavily in protecting critical technologies, managing strategic dependencies, and understanding foreign influence. In the Indo-Pacific, countries such as Japan and South Korea possess unique insights into the region that will increasingly shape global security and economic competition. Diversification, therefore, means developing complementary relationships that bring different perspective and different expertise to the table. But there is also another lesson worth considering. Recently, Sweden conducted a major review of its intelligence system led by former Prime Minister Carl Bildt. What I found interesting was not the institutional recommendations, which they are actually very interesting, but it was also the starting point of that exercise. The review did not begin by asking whether Sweden needed a new foreign intelligence service. It began by asking whether the country's intelligence requirements had changed. The conclusion was that intelligence today must address not only military threats, but also technology, economics, foreign influence, cyber threats, and broader geopolitical developments. In other words, before discussing structures, Sweden focused on defining the problem. There are many lessons here for Canada. Before asking whether we need new organizations, new partnerships, or new mandates, we should first ask, what intelligence questions are most important to Canada's future? Where are our gaps? Which capabilities do we already possess? And where do partnerships provide the greatest value? Because diversification in itself is not a strategy. It is, as I said, it's not a strategy, but it is a tool. And like any tool, its value depends on how clearly we define the problem we are trying to solve. The final point I would like to make is that successful intelligence partnerships are reciprocal. Countries share intelligence with partners who contribute value. Trust matters, capability matters, expertise matters. Canada's strengths include our research ecosystem, our technological capabilities, our role within North America, our leadership in areas such as artificial intelligence, and our reputation as a trusted and reliable partner beyond the Five Eyes. The more we invest in those strengths, the more attractive we become to both existing and future intelligence partners. So my conclusion is simple. Diversification is indeed necessary, but diversification is not about collecting new partners. Diversification is also about ensuring that Canada has access to knowledge, expertise, and relationship that is required to navigate a world that is becoming more competitive, more interconnected, and less predictable. The challenge, therefore, is not whether to diversify. The challenge is deciding where diversification will generate the greatest strategic advantage for Canada. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you. I'm going to keep my remarks pretty short. Yes, I agree Canada needs to diversify. I'm not going to have any ideas broader than the former director of CIPS or a former ambassador. So I'm not going to speak from that perspective. My observation is that in order for Canada to be ready for an altered, perhaps ruptured world order, the one that's probably upon us, some attention needs to be paid to the process and the legislation here in Canada. So I have a couple of suggestions. Firstly, we need to fully modernize CIPS authorities and funding. We have to do it carefully. Bill C-70 updated the CIPS Act to improve foreign interference and information sharing powers, but implementation matters. Clear thresholds, privacy protection, strong review. Review focused on enhancing the agency's performance, not gotcha, are essential. We need to improve intelligence sharing outside Ottawa. I know that this was a constant battle for David when he was the director. Provinces, universities, critical infrastructure, companies, the diaspora communities, they need usable threat briefs, not just classified assessments. C-70's changes, again, were partly meant to allow more disclosure beyond the federal government. We need to speak plain language to inform society of threats, including foreign interference, because it's still happening, despite what you might have heard, and because it remains a threat, and there are equally other threats that we have to talk to Canadians about, and we have to talk to other political levels about. Build a real economic security function. Canada needs better protection of research, critical minerals, defense technology, AI, quantum, I could go on. That means combining intelligence, export controls, investment review, sanctions, and procurement security and university outreach. And we don't do it effectively, and the laws that govern it are pretty weak. Review with regularity legislation. Agree with the Emergencies Act or not. There should never be a situation where Canadian legislation is not fit for purpose. So yes, rapid change can affect legislation, and that makes things difficult, but 35 years of sitting on a shelf is not rapid change. We need to be more aware and more cognizant of what the tools are that we need to use for the moment we need to use them. A national security policy, I agree, is required. Both Canadians and allies need to know who we are and what we are concerned about, where the threats are. And equally, we need a foreign policy, a capstone that defines and describes our partnerships, our role in the world, and then cascades to defense and other departments. It would also assist agencies such as CIPS as Canada builds trade relationships with non-traditional partners. There has been a lot of talk about guardrails and no discussion about what those guardrails are. And critically, it is time to assess Canada's foreign intelligence capabilities. We rely too heavily on foreign sources for foreign political developments, terrorist networks overseas, emerging conflicts, economic and technological threats, and some foreign interference activities. I experienced the avalanche of intel that is available in Canada to officials who are cleared and to decision makers. Raw intelligence and assessment from Canadian sources was equal in quality to that received from allies. Simply, there was less of it. Further, in these very polarized times, should action need to be taken on intelligence, Canadians may not trust it if it was received from another country. And while the professionals we worked with were just that, highly professional and expert, the politicization of assessment should concern us all. So there are many ways to do this. Expand CSIS, look at a new agency, new authorities for CSE. What matters in this moment, to me, is intent and the understanding of what we as a country need. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Carrie, please.
So I'm going to try and answer the questions that Professor Junot posed. Why, when, and how we should diversify Canada's security relationships. And I'll do that in 4 minutes. So the narrative is, the accepted narrative is we need to diversify Canada's security partnerships because the US is a less reliable partner and threats are more diffuse and globalized. So we need a wider range of partners to counter shared threats and give us more leverage with the US. That's great. Absolutely agree with that. But there are important nuances to the storyline. And I guess the more important message is there's a lot of very detailed work that needs to go into some of those choices along that journey of the narrative. Who to partner with, on what threats, define those guardrails, because they're not defined. We just say we need guardrails, right? To protect our national security interests. And there's slow diplomatic work needed to build the trust and channels of cooperation that can actually implement those diverse partnership agreements. So ideally, this work should begin with prioritizing the security threats Canada faces. But there are 2 problems or challenges here. First, we don't have, as Thomas said, we don't have a history of writing down our national security threats and interests, nor of setting down on paper the overarching international policy that would drive prioritization. And the second problem is that our intelligence machinery isn't set up to ensure integrated threat assessments, nor to connect those threat assessments with strategic policy choices in our foreign policy, our international trade, and our security and defense relations. So in the intelligence community, we've long talked about the gap from intelligence to evidence, but here there's a gap that could persist between intelligence analysis and international policy that's still missing. We need to articulate that threat environment publicly, ideally, and I think 4 people have said this today, in regular national security reviews, underpinned by clear foreign policy priorities, trade, security, intelligence, and defense. And that would achieve a number of objectives that I think are currently missing in action. It would serve as a forcing function for the civil service to integrate their views. It would send a signal to Canada's allies about our concerns and priorities. You raised that point. And I think most importantly, it would send a signal to Canadians about why they should care. So most press releases out of PMO these days start with the lines, "The world is a more dangerous place," and then go on to use the word rupture somewhere. This is great. It is, like, I absolutely agree. I think that realist approach is good. But unless the government starts explaining to Canadians what they should be worried about and why, and how greater defense spending actually helps counter those threats, I fear that public support for the 5% of GDP on defense is going to start waning, and trust is going to start waning. We're in a sweet spot right now, a honeymoon that won't last a long time. Our prioritization of national security actions has to be driven by a conscious articulation of our security vulnerabilities. So an obvious vulnerability is decades of underinvestment, and we talk about it in defense because we kept getting hammered at NATO when I was there, but it's also been in security and in diplomacy. And in a way, defense spending has gone, well, it's gone like this now, but even then it was going like this, and diplomacy has been going like this over the last 2 decades. And security spending has not met the demands on the security apparatus inside Canada, right? And we know that that's because we've relied on the US. So then we go back to the narrative, we have to diversify our security partnerships because the US is unreliable. But the fact is, the benefit of geography still pertains. Yes, the US is more unpredictable. Yes, Donald Trump is a more unreliable security partner, but we still have geography that will protect us at least from many physical threats. And it is still in the US interest to continue to work with us on continental security. So we will continue to benefit from a geographic security dividend. We can't rely on it, but we have to be very, very careful and walk a very fine line between securing our security sovereignty and not causing the US to come back and punish us too much. But we have to be very careful as we walk that fine line, because if we self-censor too much, we'll actually help Donald Trump implement his vision of the Dunroe document that he articulated in their national security strategy, where the US will decide our security partners for us. We don't want to do that, so it's a very fine line. Related problem, and I said our continent, our geography protects us from physical threats, is that there are increasingly threats that ignore distance and borders, and we're less prepared on that front. And you've spoken about that. Cyber attacks on comms, energy infrastructure, threats from space, pandemics, climate disasters, and attacks on our democracy. So these are all security threats that fall into the civilian space or into that gray zone below the conflict threshold. They're cheap and cheerful tools for aggressors and adversaries to use, and we are not prepared. And not all defense spending will help counter those. So we need to invest more in civilian solutions to those threats that are traditionally in the civilian security space, like democratic resilience to foreign interference or disinformation. These all require whole of society engagement. So back to my earlier point about regular dialogue with Canadians, a Canadian public that's more security literate will be better positioned to develop whole of society solutions. So it's no coincidence you see in Finland, Sweden, the Baltics, and in Taiwan, a very developed whole of society response to security threats that runs the whole continuum from pure civilian security to defense assets to respond, including the private sector. But all of those countries I listed, they share one thing: proximity to a major power that poses a threat to not just their territories, but their way of life, and their social infrastructure and cohesion. Sound familiar? We've taken a while to wake up to this. I'm not saying that the US is the primary threat, but I am saying that we don't have that whole of Canada threat approach to security vulnerabilities. So we need to invest. And I'll finish, 2 more points to make, and then I'll stop. First, last point in my kind of logic is that a structured analysis would then choose the countries that would best help us counter those prioritized security vulnerabilities. Well, that's easy. We're vulnerable in the Arctic. We deepen our cooperation with Arctic allies. We let it lie fallow for a while, do more on that front. Easy. Relative, we share democratic values with them. Easy. Costs, as long as we pay enough to play, we'll be at that table. But what we're doing now with diversifying security partnerships, we're going beyond those traditional allies, and quite often We're diversifying to partner countries where I would say our main driver is trade. That's okay. We've moved beyond that stark political debate of we don't talk to bad guys, we don't go along to get along, that kind of thing. But as we deepen those partnerships with countries where the primary driver might be trade, we also have to think about how we deal with the security vulnerabilities and how we understand them. Because those security vulnerabilities on our trade agenda show up in two different ways. First, it's the security vulnerabilities created by our trading patterns. We're not so good at analyzing that. But here, and some of you in the room might not agree with me, it's the use of security tools as a necessary precondition to having a healthy, sustainable trading relationship. So it's not like our efforts to do development assistance, democracy, human rights, and all of those tools are fluffy values-laden things. Those are necessary preconditions to creating some of the sustainable markets. Transparency and good governance allow you to execute on a contract, right? So there's a security aspect on kind of two ends of our trade relationship, and we don't sufficiently understand that. So on the policy front, 2 gaps, and on the machinery front, 4 gaps. Trade, I just walked through it. Insufficient understanding of the security implications of our trading patterns, insufficient policy analysis of the links between the tools we've traditionally used to build stable democracies, open, transparent governments, and our trade interests. So those are our 2 gaps on the policy front, and we can fill those if we make some machinery changes, but here are 4 machinery gaps. GAC budget cuts, we've all talked about it, don't need to get into it, I don't think. But more importantly, some targeted GAC global affairs dismantling of security programming that had been used to build that kind of capacity in fragile states, including market capacity. That was dismantled a couple of years ago after the security environment changed. It doesn't make sense to me. Third, global security reporting program was dismantled. I think that came from, that was a dedicated targeted diplomatic reporting chain on targeted security priorities that was dismantled. And fourth, not enough presence of post of defense attaches, intelligence personnel with sufficient overseas mandates to inject intel and analyses that would inform countries of Ottawa of a country's intentions. And my last point around multilateralism. We need to avoid the Trump transaction trap. Do you like that? Yeah. Transactional trap. As we diversify our security partnerships, we do it through a series of bilateral or plurilateral comprehensive partnership agreements, different names, right? But the UN's still there. Security architecture doesn't work, never really did, but there are security elements in the UN that do work, and the UN gives us a table of ready partners that we can do that variable geometry with. NATO, yes, we need to invest and engage with European partners on security, but if we don't crosswalk it back to NATO, we're actually undercutting the place where we have a voice and a veto. So don't throw the multilateral baby out with the bathwater as we seek to reinvest. So that's my unsolicited list of things that I think the government should do. I won't go through them again. Tell me when you disagree and tell me when you agree.
Thank you all so much for these excellent presentations. The floor is open. I will only remind you our housekeeping rules. If you would please just identify yourself, and if you have an institutional affiliation, please state that. Please put your hands high up so that the CIPS team can see you. The mic will magically come to you, and I think we already have someone. Yes, Lauren.
Hi, thank you. My name is Chris. I'm at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. You spoke about legislative amendments development, which is important to intelligence sharing and its expansion. Can you also speak about, the privacy aspects of it? As we know, Bill C-22 right now, the lawful access bill, is under quite scrutiny. So how do you manage those 2 things and balancing them? Thank you.
Thank you.
Certainly, I won't be the only person who has a view on this. I don't think it is impossible in 2026 to move forward with the tools that are needed and legislative changes that are needed, and keep in mind privacy. And so the bill as it first went forward was probably too expansive for round one. Things can be refined and modified, and we can do things in steps and stages. And so I think going from 0 to 100 was probably too much. But there are things that we need to address in the intelligence space and the legislative space that still are not on the table. Open source intelligence, for example, scraping off the internet has privacy implications, even though most citizens think that what they put on the internet, on Twitter or whatever it's called now, are open communications. They're in fact private communications, but they're very useful information that we can use and that we could have used, for example, during the convoy, but privacy laws prevented us. And we wanted to ensure we did things legally. And so I think that we have been too weighted towards individual privacy rather than the collective good. But I think things can be done absolutely in stages, and it is not the big crisis that it's being made out to be.
I probably need to jump on this one as well. So we talked about strategic autonomy. We talked about sovereignty. You may have seen yesterday, or yeah, I believe it's yesterday, media reporting on the new AI strategy the government's contemplating, and talking again using those words like sovereignty and autonomy. You cannot do national security, and you cannot fulfill the promise of the government, which is to protect its citizens. Every speech from the throne starts with talking about, the responsibility, the utmost responsibility of the federal government is to protect its citizens. If you don't have the tools to do that, and Bill C-22 absolutely needs to be debated. But I can tell you from experience, the number of times that we had to essentially rely on foreign sources of information about what was happening in our country is absolutely unacceptable. And so what is the right debate? I have spoken to this at length when I was the director. I believe that we are a sophisticated society, that it should not be a zero-sum game between Big Brother and pure civil liberty. I think we are, and we owe it to our citizens to find that right balance. And the status quo, Canada being the only advanced country, democracy governed by the rule of law that does not have an adequate regime for lawful access, is completely unacceptable.
Thank you. Next question. Yes.
Hi, Christopher Nardi. I'm a journalist at the National Post. Monsieur Vigneault, si on peut transitionner en français comme vous aviez demandé tantôt, you can answer in English as you please. I want to piggyback partly on what you just said on lawful access and kind of transition to what Ms. Thomas said about foreign intelligence capacity. You talked about the fact that there's an unacceptable amount of tips basically that come from abroad on our security. How do you deal with the issue that we do have a key intelligence partner, that even within government there are fears, there are threats of pulling out of intelligence sharing when we rely on them so much at this point? How do you deal with that? And what are your thoughts on foreign intelligence agency capacity in light of that? And should Canadians be afraid that the U.S. stops sharing this intelligence at a time when we apparently can't gather it ourselves, according to your comments?
I think these are the right questions to ask. There is, and it was mentioned, I think it was by you, General Air, about how this is being communicated, how people are gathering their information about what is really happening. I was having a private discussion earlier, and I can tell you from my experience, both when I was in place during the first Trump administration, and now that I am still engaged in talking about national security issues from a different perspective. I can tell you that from what I know, the intelligence sharing has not diminished. Even with when it was said publicly that it was being diminished with other countries. I'm not referring to Canada, but I'm thinking here more about what's happening in Ukraine, for example. And so I think the rhetoric and what is being discussed is one thing. At the practical level right now, it is not happening, but I think we should not fool ourselves that it may not stop. I think, especially when it comes to foreign intelligence, so intents of foreign powers, for example, or when it comes more to economic security, there's more competition there, and so therefore there will be. I think we should be very mindful that there might be less sharing about some of these issues, and that's why I think it is important to go back to my first principle, which is look at the gaps. Look at what are the intelligence requirements of the country now and in the future. How do we fulfill these intelligence requirements? And based on that, make a conscious decision. And one of the things that I had the opportunity to speak to Prime Minister Bildt about his review and give some perspective on this. And I think what is interesting in the context of what Sweden has been doing is to start from that premise of looking at those gaps and what Sweden in 2026 and beyond needed. But it's also that's why they said in their case they said yes, we need a foreign intelligence service. The reality is that they already had one. A lot of that was being done by the military service, doing some of that intelligence collection. But what they realize is much more integration in the center, an ability to fuse that intelligence, to collect more specifically, uniquely important information for Sweden, but also very importantly, and I think it's critical also for Canada, it's to broaden its open source intelligence. Right now, every day, there's more data that is being produced, open source data is being produced in one day that would take intelligence agencies decades to go through and analyze based on the current models. So I think there is an absolute requirement to do that distinction. So bottom line, I think Canada may need a foreign intelligence service. I really do hope that the government is doing its review, and I think it's not just because of the changes it's happening with some of our partners, but it is to go back to what is fundamentally what is in Canada's national interest and what do we need to have the autonomy and sovereignty that is required.
Thank you. I think we have questions on this side.
Hi, my name's Nati Pressman. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced measures to combat anti-Semitism, including a Council on Combating Hate, and he also added that there will be future funding for more funding for the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. He also reiterated the Canada Community Security Program, which was formerly the Security Infrastructure Program, as I'm sure you are all familiar with, and also Bill C9. My question is, what other measures can the government do to work with provinces and municipalities to combat anti-Semitism, and what can security infrastructure and the government do to collaborate with Canadians and civil society to combat it as well?
Thank you. Anyone like to?
I think this is a fundamental issue, not just anti-Semitism, but radicalization writ large in our society. This is something that in my previous life, I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand, trying to help refocus, and trying to, in terms of our resources within CSIS, but also to find the right way across the federal government, both within the bureaucracy, but also at the political level, to essentially say we need to have a different dialogue with Canadians. And I think it starts with that. For example, one of the important department that should be engaged in that discussion is Heritage Canada, with all of the work that they do in trying to build cohesion in our society and so on. I think it's just going to get worse, unfortunately. We've talked about social media. We talked about the polarization. We talked about the anarchy of algorithms. I think it's just going to get much worse. And so specifically, what I think it needs to be done specifically for anti-Semitism, but also in more writ large for radicalization that can lead to violence, I think is a couple of things. One is to have the actors. So I applaud what is being done now is to bring the actors together and speak about it. The work that was being done before by the envoys on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, I think was valuable, was needed, but was not brought at a strategic level enough in government to have an impact. You mentioned provinces, you mentioned municipalities. These are all actors that have a closer impact on day-to-day life of people in Canada, and actually most jurisdictions. So I think it's critical that they are part of that equation. The number of times we've had discussions with provinces, territories, sometimes municipalities, with trying to bring, not to teach them, not to bring our wisdom, but to essentially say, hey, this is what we see, this is what we're concerned about. These are something probably we should be talking about. So I think there is an element of that, but you don't get out of radicalization through policing only. Policing is important. We saw potentially the deterrent impact that the new force in Toronto, the integrated force, has had on some anti-Semitic crimes in Toronto. I think that is needed, but it's much more than that is required. And maybe last thing I would say is that engagement needs to be real. I'll stray a little bit from pure radicalization, but one of the things that we had done at CSIS was we talk about the Arctic, how important the Arctic is. And so the one thing when we talk to our friends in the North is they say you cannot talk about the Arctic without engaging with us. And so we got out of our way and to try to engage with Northern partners. And one of the example that was very useful, we co-authored some work with the Inuit Tapahit Kanatami organization. So we published in French, English, and Inuktitut some literature that speak to those national security issues. So the final thing I would say on this, the point about how to engage and sustain the population and civil society to support these engagement, these budgetary increases, potentially new legislation, I believe is to that real engagement with people, not just elected officials in different places, but it is a real concern, radicalization in our country.
So I agree completely with everything David said. I also think that when things go wrong, municipalities and communities look to the federal government to fix things too quickly, and that's not the kind of nation we are, right? We're a federation, and we have multiple levels of government, and this starts at the provincial level with education, where the government, I think, has through budget cuts and changes of programs, we don't have a multiculturalism perspective any longer. New Canadians don't get a perspective about what it is to be Canadian any longer. Those programs have all been eliminated. If they exist, they're very ad hoc. And so it isn't helping with unity of our society. And those are things that we have to talk about. In terms of radicalization, in my last year as NSIA, teenagers, and we're not talking 18, 19-year-olds, we're talking 13, 14-year-olds, were building bombs to blow up gay pride parades, and his excellent work stopped it. It could be gay pride parades, it could be Hanukkah celebrations, it could be any number of things, but we are not doing a good enough job in communities, in schools, with our youth, about what Canadian values are, about what the responsibility of society is. And I think that it's not too late, but it's becoming too late. We are relying on the federal government and policing organizations to do far more than we ever have before. And we don't understand what our children are seeing and absorbing and how that is affecting their perspective and their actions.
Thank you.
Okay.
And we're talking about it now as if it's a phenomenon we'll deal with once it hits our shores. But the fact is there's an international ecosystem out there that sends information, disinformation, and messages that can help radicalize and radicalize not just Canadians, but feeder populations coming in too. And so when the Prime Minister talks about variable geometry and coalitions of the willing, this is an area, there's actually been a fair bit of necessary but insufficient coordination across smaller groups of middle powers through the G7, because that's an easier place to do it. But we even did it at NATO, where we talked about lessons learned, best practices, just how to counter foreign interference in our elections. There would be briefings at NATO prior to major electoral cycles, so we would know in advance what the expected lines of propaganda were. to create social conflict in advance and to call into question those elections. Those conversations were happening at the EU. Harder to have at the UN, but you can still have it at parts of the UN. So the challenge for us internationally is to double down on those efforts, but also to stitch them together. Do you know what I mean? So they're not these little islands of good ideas that then aren't translated back to our domestic responses. Because as I said, it's a whole it's not just the algorithms, there's actually some malicious intent there.
Thank you so much. Other questions? Yes, I see two on this side. Wesley.
Wesley Wark, Center for International Governance Innovation. Lots of questions I could ask this panel, but one issue that hasn't...
Fire alarm, fire alarm.
Oh, you're safe now, David. One question that issue hasn't been raised is the Alberta separatist movement and the potential it presents. And the question I have for the panel is, the federal government has built lots of capabilities to monitor and potentially respond to foreign interference. The Alberta government has none. It strikes me as a huge gap. And I wonder what any of you think could be done to fill that gap in terms of ensuring that some of these federal government capabilities could be deployed to monitor foreign interference in the Alberta separatist referendum to come. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone? David?
This speaks to a little bit what we're talking about earlier about the role of the federal government, as you said, Jody, and how to engage with other levels of government. And it's unfortunate that it has not been done more before, so now we have to essentially start from scratch in the case of a very concrete case of the referendum that's going to take place. We know there is right now, I think it's been said publicly. I can tell you that a number of people internationally have shared also that they're really concerned that what's going to happen here because they've seen the playbook of Russia, for example, sowing dissension. There will also be, so nation state is easier in the sense easier. So that's when you can get the federal government, the CIPS Act and the CSE capabilities, you can bring that to bear with nation state. When it's coming from civil society within your country or within, in this case, we should expect there will be a lot of overt commentary, but also some covert bots and so on that will be paid for by U.S. interest. And so how do you bring a level of awareness to the people who can do something about it? I'm not sure the federal government is going to have the stronger voice in Alberta, but I think it has to be one voice. So how the Canadian government can organize itself to speak to that publicly? How can the federal government can work with the Alberta government, but also other elements of civil society, the election on Alberta equivalent that will have to be involved in this, and how to share best practices, how to share indicators, how to share potentially concrete information. There's been discussion about a number of, including Premier Smith getting her security clearance. I think it is important to get those clearances, not because of the day-to-day tactical classified intelligence you need to share, but it's to be able to bring a level of awareness in using classified information with open source information to bring about that level of understanding of tactics. What people should be on the lookout for. I think it's maybe disinformation, so maybe I was been silenced because of what I was saying, but I do believe that it will require more than just the federal government. I think also there will be a number of actors within Alberta who will have an opportunity to either be a positive influence on what is being the right information or the truthful information that is being disseminated, or on the other hand, amplify potential disinformation that will be there. So we have a representative of the media here in the room. I think they will have to play a very important role to have to bring to a level of awareness and to bring other voices that and give them space to speak to this type of issue. Not that people will be looking at traditional media, and change their habits, from for the referendum. but I think it will require, we just unfortunately that the Habs have lost, but it will require the 20 players on the bench to be going in the same direction if we are to have an impact.
I would add as well that you need to have a willing partner. So you actually have to have a province that wants to hear what's going on. And I'm not saying they don't, but you have to have a willing partner. If it were an election in Alberta that was contentious and we were really concerned about, we'd stand up the site team and they would be monitoring for foreign interference. I don't know why we couldn't do that for a referendum. We have 2 on the agenda for this year, and then have the very public weekly briefs from the experts that were led during the election, which I thought was a huge step in transparency when we talked about foreign interference with weekly briefs led by PCO. Do the same for the 2 referendum that are potentially ahead of us. I think it's a tool that is underutilized, and I think it would bring great clarity. Now, I may have been the only person in this room who watched those briefs, but let me tell you, they were great. And we should be paying more attention to what's happening. But the mechanisms to understand what's going on in foreign interference in that referendum exist. We should just use them.
Just one small point to add. It's around security literacy too. And if we had regular security threat assessments that came out at the national level and then targeted to those vulnerable sectors, so critical infrastructure in energy, banking, for instance, telecoms, and then democratic resilience. So we know what the areas of vulnerability are. We don't have those targeted conversations frequently enough. They're happening, but they're not frequent enough. And it is very difficult to relay the information about the specific threats. But we don't even have that national regular security threat assessment conversation with Canadians. We've kind of fallen into the world where we do defense policy by procurement announcements. We do international crisis response by number of program dollars out, number of refugees in. We don't talk about the why very much, and we don't unleash the communications potential across the public service, which I think is a missed opportunity, but it's actually quite dangerous because of those threats, unseen but really costly.
So I would just add the ambassador's absolutely right. Who knows what our national threat level is right now? The first time most Canadians hear about the national threat level produced by ITAC should not be when we raise it, which we've never done. But there will potentially come a day where we have to, and that should not be the first time it's understood or talked about.
Sorry, thank you. Okay, great to see so many hands. Yes.
Many thanks. Amadou Sidi Diallo, analyst with the Canada School of Public Service. So a sovereign Canada versus the Donroe Doctrine. So I think Madame Bock said that we certainly don't want the United States to tell us who to choose as partners. But concretely, do you have a recipe to how best Canada can articulate that Monroe but Donroe doctrine? Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that alarmed me most in that national security strategy was the notion that the US would ensure that their partners in the hemisphere wouldn't invest in critical infrastructure with adversaries and, difficult countries. They meant China, but they meant China plus plus. And they also took a much broader definition of what critical infrastructure was than one might think. Telecoms, electricity grids, energy, critical minerals, etc. The saving grace for us and others in the hemisphere is that the national security strategy is kind of like a political wish list of everyone in the interagency process who throws in their ideological gems. It was a lovely thing to read, but it's not actually implemented kind of straight line. But it is enough of a ideological signal from the administration that we have to worry. So then we get into kind of the mechanics of the bilateral relationship. The challenge is, or we have to not ask permission and just do, which is what the Prime Minister is doing with his series of comprehensive, security partnerships with countries X, Y, Z. So don't ask permission, but also be prepared for that pushback, potentially punishment. From the states when we step over a line and procure from someone else that they don't like. But that goes back to building resilience in those sectors as well, I think. So what that resilience looks like in practical terms, we'd have to walk through each sector, right? But I mean, on critical minerals, for instance, doubling down on processing rather than relying, as we did for so long, on extraction of raw materials. So we're moving in that direction, just we're slow, right? Otherwise, we have to rely, we've got a dependency on China, an over-dependency on China that creates a security vulnerability for us, and it creates a vulnerability for us with our neighbor to the south. So you could walk through each sector and in very concrete terms, rack and stack what resilience needs to achieve. I don't have the skill set to do that. I did a bad job on critical minerals, and don't get me on the energy grid, but there you go.
Thank you. I think there was another, yes, right at the back.
Hello, Tristan Côté, étudiant à la maîtrise en sécurité et défense. So my question is, what place does Canada's intelligence have in how we navigate our relationship with the US by following or supporting or refusing to follow their endeavors around the world when some of their decision making isn't based on intelligence or goes against intelligence assessment?
Thank you.
So I wasn't, that is the $6 billion question. Christian, bien fait, j'ai pas de réponse. Mais je vais essayer une petite réponse. I wasn't there for Iraq 1. I know that we can withstand saying no to the US, but during Iraq 1, that was a more reasonable US. For Iran, I told myself I wasn't going to intervene publicly on Iran because it's too hard and it outrages me. So your question is complicated. How much does intelligence figure in our decision about what we're going to do? A little bit, but we've got bigger fish to fry, to be honest. Intelligence can give us the fact basis to say no and to explain to the Americans and to the Canadian public why we're saying no if we decided to do absolutely nothing on Iran to help them. But there are bigger issues at play, and those bigger issues around avoiding a disproportionate punishment from an enraged president when we say no publicly. So you will have seen the dance from the government of Canada on our positioning on Iran, which has been very carefully calibrated to walk that fine line I talked about between not getting punished and holding to our guns on some things that actually matter to us. I think they had a failure at the beginning in not recognizing the rule of law, that's in our national interest too, and calibrate it up to a point where we're having a very careful dance on Iran. And then secretly, in order to protect NATO and our bilateral relationship, and then a number of NATO allies are actually helping on Iran in a way that the US isn't choosing to recognize. So you're caught in politics, and the intel is just a small part of the answer to those politics. It can be useful when you need to use it.
I would add that intelligence is just, it's data points. And used properly, it helps form a complete picture of something. Often it is the basis for a decision or for a discussion. a piece of intelligence comes in and decision makers need to see it, but the intelligence itself is not the only thing that decisions are based upon, and certainly not action or support of a foreign, it's a war, no matter what they call it, it's a foreign war. I would also say that what's interesting about the world right now, the Globe and Mail ran a really interesting piece on it a couple of months ago. It's about the politics of sycophancy and how countries are being terribly sycophantic to avoid being on the firing line. And I think it is something that we have to work very assiduously to avoid. And, you know, we have seen, I don't want to call out any leaders here, but talk to me later if you want, terrible displays of sycophancy, and they're being, you know, credited with being Trump whisperers. They're not. And so principled decisions need to be made, and those decisions can change through the course of an activity, of a offensive, of a foreign policy action, of a war. You can decide that, no, we're not going to get involved, and then change your mind and decide we need to because conditions have changed, or the opposite. But it's got to be a sophisticated, very thorough discussion and analysis, and intelligence is often just the start of that.
Je vais répondre très rapidement à 3 points pour la question. The first one is to riff off what Jody just said. Anna Applebaum from The Atlantic has written, and I think she has coined the term the enablers, about the people who are helping, you know, the most egregious actions. So I think there will be a time of reckoning eventually for some people, the positions they've taken. On Iran specifically, I would say to a very large extent, intelligence is not the issue, is not a key factor in this. It has not been based on new threats or new intelligence assessment, having discovered new capabilities of Iran that needed to be, you know, thwarted or contained. It has been a much more political decision made. And so I think we have to be careful from that point of view. Intelligence was a critical factor to build the awareness, the intelligence, the picture about the capabilities, intentions of Iran. But I'm not sure that the intelligence people have been listened to or even been asked to a large extent. I think the more fundamental point of the question from me is not the today, the moment. I try to see the connect the dots that are happening, you know, today and tomorrow. It's more the role of intelligence writ large in now and in the future. And going back to what we have said is, what does Canada need to make sovereign decisions? And some of that absolutely requires a really, really good integration of the Five Eyes. And the US has intelligence capabilities unrivaled by anyone, both human, SIGINT, imagery, and many other things. And so I think, you know, it would be absolutely foolish for all the reasons that have been mentioned to but that doesn't mean that we cannot build our own capabilities, that we should not be talking to enlarge our partnerships with others who are filling some of these gaps. But also intelligence, and there's a concept that we've been working on, we call it intelligence diplomacy. And intelligence diplomacy is very essential in many parts of the world, where the people who have voices and access to the leaders will not be your typical, you know, conduits of diplomats and so on. In many countries, it will be the security apparatus that will have the upper end. And this is why I think intelligence capability for Canada goes beyond the ability to collect secrets and analyze those secrets, but also to work in a partnership with other nations that are engaged in some of these discussions that are not very much public, but are absolutely essential to the way we need to conduct business in a very complicated world.
The floor is still open for another few minutes. So if you do have questions, I have many questions, but I do not want to impose my. Yes, Tasnim, please. Great to see our students be so active.
Yes.
Thank you. My question is, how do we improve coordination on national security across departments in government?
So I actually just talked to the Canadian Forces College about this. So much of what happens in the federal government in terms of crisis coordination is based on personalities. It's not written down, it's not codified. And it starts with who are the senior ADMs and who are the deputy ministers and who's the NSIA and who what they see their roles as being. Because some elements of ADM and DM jobs are pretty clear and others are based on the interests of that individual and the direction they want to take the job. And so codifying it a little bit, I think is useful. I think that the mandate letter that my successor as NSIA received was useful because it said she would be the leader in terms of crisis coordination. But I think bottom line, it is incumbent upon leaders in all of the Canadian Forces Defense, the security agencies, global affairs, and PCO to build relationships so that you know who you can rely on and how they're going to respond in the moment of crises. And so nobody gets to these jobs without a lot of experience, and the town is small. We all know each other very well, and it will always depend somewhat on relationships. But I think a bit of codification and I think the mandate letter of the NSIA was useful.
Yeah, from an international perspective, I see it from the perspective of where are the points of integration that work and where are the points of disintegration or the disconnects. So at mission abroad, that's a place where you get integration of all the equities that Canada has at stake on a international security issue that then becomes a national security issue. We see our trade interests, our immigration interests, our foreign policy interests, and some of our national security cohesion interests, not as much on that last front. But if we don't have the right people at our embassies abroad, so we don't have enough defense attaches, we don't have enough intelligence, and I would support a foreign intelligence capacity. From my perspective, we absolutely need it. And we need those people on the ground working that kind of team. Then if you walk it back to headquarters, for me, the biggest gap was between trade and the national security apparatus. So we would take decisions on the national security side without fully understanding the domestic trade implications. We got the international trade, but not that, this factory will be shut down if we do X, because we weren't talking to the right people. So we need that kind of whole of government that crosses the lines of effort in a way that's much more sophisticated than we've done in the past. That's for me the biggest gap.
Just very quickly to support what my colleagues have just said, the one thing that brings this also together is, and we're in Ottawa, so we need to speak about machinery of government. When Carrie spoke about some of the gaps, one of the things that has been put in place under the last administration, Prime Minister Trudeau created the National Security Council. And the reality is that, I'll say this now, government anymore, this is not for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is the most informed person in government. The NSIAs do that role. He has access to all of the officials, and he is personally the best brief person. The problem is the coordination of the town, as I call it, is you have other ministers who have mandate letters, who have very challenging jobs, under a lot of pressure to deliver. And so they will look at things, and be very focused on how to deliver. But when it comes time to talk about all of these complex issues that we've talked about, it's not a single minister. It's not a single perspective. What Carrie described about the dynamic in an embassy, take that and multiply it by 10 or 100 here in Ottawa with all of the other departments and so on. And I think what has been said about the current Prime Minister is that is a very, very tight circle of people controlling a lot of things. And I do believe that there is a need for that in some issues, but there is also a need to build the muscle memory, to build the awareness among more senior officials, also a lot other elected officials, other ministers. And if you don't do that, that's when we have real problems. And I have gray hair because of some of these problems. So I will just leave it at that.
Well, thank you so much. As you can see, we're getting very good at sharing microphones. Before we conclude, I'd like to take advantage of the fact we have such brilliant experts here to seek their advice. We have so many students in the room and so many of us are teachers. What would you advise us to learn and to do in order to prepare the next generation of security and defense experts?
I don't even know where to begin. I mean, you guys are graduating at a moment when there are deep, deep cuts across most of government, except for defense and CISs. But I don't want you to be disheartened. I built a security career outside of national defense and CISs. I focused on security for 30 years. It was a fantastic career. I had so much fun and a lot of gray hairs as a result of the problems. So I guess don't dismiss it, but stay in school long enough to wait out this current storm, but to learn more. Because my second point is that to be a security professional, if you're too narrow about what your definition of security is, you won't be able to do even that narrow security job properly. That was my point when I talked about civilian security spaces. Like economic security is huge. You can do security from private sector. You will do security from private sector. So don't limit yourself to government. Consider government and wait us out, please, because it's worth it.
I agree with that completely. So a couple of things I've done recently, I've talked to some business leaders about what they should do to ensure that they are ready for the world that we exist in. And they have risk advisors, but it's all about financial and business risk. It's not about global risk. It's not about geopolitical risk. And so you need to be selling yourselves to the private sector about your ability to give advice on geopolitical risk and how it's going to affect their ability to function. And I also think that the non-security departments are a really important element of this. I was speaking to a former colleague yesterday who I said, well, what are you saying to the deputy minister at NRCan about oil and gas and what's going on in the intelligence world and being discussed about oil and gas in the intelligence world? I imagine, not that I have access any longer, that there's quite a bit, and I think it would be very useful, but we tend to keep those things in the security department. So get cleared and get that individual, he would be cleared, and start to talk to other deputy ministers about the world and intelligence and how it affects their ability to function and conduct trade and grow business and grow the economy. I've been using this line a lot lately. When my dad was vice chief of the defense staff, Perrin Beatty was the minister, and he told Perrin Beatty, you can have as much sovereignty as you're willing to buy. We are in the business of buying back our sovereignty right now across a number of sectors in Canada. And so understanding the foreign policy, the defense, the security, the intelligence implications of all the things we want to do in the world, it's never been more critical.
I'm just going to be very precise about one aspect of this is the advice I've given and the advice I would give you if you're interested in geopolitical issues, intelligence, and wanting to work in this field. I would say also become literate about technology. I see it in our organization now. We have a dedicated group of intelligence specialists, extremely capable linguists, native capabilities in many cases, who have deep experience into intelligence and some of the very specific target sets we're interested in open source. But the one thing that is making the distinction is their ability also to leverage technology, artificial intelligence, understand the technological landscape, not just as an intellectual project, but as something also that you can harness yourself. I would say spend some time doing that. It will be potentially the differentiator between yourself and somebody else who would be interested in hiring.
Thank you so much. I think they deserve a huge round of applause. Thank you all. Before I conclude, and I will invite my friend and colleague Thomas Junot to conclude this session, I would like to, on behalf of CIPS, to thank all of you for being here today, to thank the Office of Vice President Research and the President herself for her support, to thank Thomas for his leadership, and to invite all of you to join us for more exciting CIPS events. It is June, but we're not slowing down anytime soon. We'll have another conference later this week, and then one more June 18 on illusions and realities of Canadian foreign policy. I'm sure we'll continue to discuss some of the issues and questions we've addressed today, and I'm delighted to say that we'll also bring back some of today's wonderful speakers. So please join us on that date and beyond. Thank you so much, and Thomas, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. So just a quick word to wrap up the afternoon. So I think as David Vigneault said in his presentation, when thinking about diversification, it's essential to think about it as a tool, as not as a strategy, not as an end in itself. So I think today we were able to ask some of the important questions, not only as a tool for what, which is something that we, I think, still need to figure out much better, but we were also able to think a bit about the sub-questions beneath that, how to use that tool or the tools of diversification. To what end do we want to do that? I'd also like to emphasize a point that Jody brought up, but also that General Eyre brought up, which is what you called process and what you called the engagement capacity, which I think are more or less not the same thing, but a similar issue that we have really neglected for decades on this issue. We need to pay a lot more attention and maybe stop rolling our eyes when we talk about process, because without the tools that you mentioned, whether the legislative ones, the bureaucratic ones, the defense attachés, the liaison officers, and so on, whatever answers we come up at a more theoretical level in terms of to what end, if we are not able on the ground to implement them, then we will not be able to achieve whatever answers we come up with at a more strategic level. And I think we still have a lot of granular work to do at that level. So on that, I hope that CIPS, the U15, are able in 2 weeks at that next event, are able to contribute to that debate. We do hope that CIPS will turn this event into an annual national security conference. So I hope to see you in May or June next year for part 2 of this event. So I'd like to thank in particular the CIPS staff who were extremely helpful in making this event happen. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you to the Office of the Vice President for Research and Innovation for their support for the event. Particular thank you, as ever, to our students who came up to the event in pretty good numbers today and asked, I would say, the best questions that our speakers got. So thank you very much. And please do not forget to pick up the extra food on your way out. It's there for you. Yeah, you know. Thank you also to our participants at the event who were on Zoom. We had about 150 people who signed up for the event on Zoom. I don't have the final number of how many were there, but I hope you also enjoyed the show. And finally, obviously, thank you to our speakers and also our keynote and our first session. Thank you very much for making this possible. So on that, thank you. Have a good evening and hope to see you at future CIPS events.